by 9 o'clock on a bright June morning in 1858. Agnes Lethbridge had already finished the bridal lace for another woman and been reminded twice that she would never need any of her own. She sat beside the long window at Lethbridge House, with a narrow band of ivory lace across her lap, guiding the final knot with the small mother-of-pearl tatting shuttle that had belonged to her mother. Its pale surface was worn smooth where familiar fingers had held it for years. Agnes had been clumsy with it as a girl. Her mother had laughed, untangled her mistakes, and told her that patience was merely skill, practiced slowly. Agnes remembered the words more often than she admitted. Around her, the house moved with the purposeful confusion of a wedding day. A maid carried gloves upstairs. Another hurried past with orange blossoms. Somewhere above, a cousin complained that one sleeve sat lower than the other. Agnes drew the last thread tight, inspected the edge, and clipped it neatly. "Finished," she said. Florence, standing before the pier glass, while a maid adjusted the fall of her pale blue morning gown, looked over. At 23, Florence possessed the kind of beauty that required very little assistance and received a great deal of it. "You have become extraordinarily good at bridal lace," she said. "At this rate, Agnes, you'll have made enough for every bride in London except yourself." The maid's hands paused. Agnes laid the shuttle in her palm. She had learned that cruelty rarely announced itself as cruelty in respectable houses. It preferred wit. "Then London should be grateful for my industry," she replied. Florence's smile sharpened. "You always make it sound as if you don't mind." "That saves everyone the trouble of asking whether I do." Before Florence could answer, Sir Archibald Lethbridge appeared in the doorway. He was 61, widowed, impeccably dressed, and already wearing the expression he reserved for occasions at which family reputation might be observed by people who mattered. "Florence, do stop provoking your sister. Agnes has had years to become comfortable with her position." He glanced at the finished lace. "Is that done?" "Yes, Papa." "Good. At least someone remembers what she is useful for." He spoke lightly, as though usefulness were praise enough to erase everything else. Agnes folded the lace into tissue and handed it to the waiting maid. She had spent years performing the tasks no one remembered assigning. She found misplaced gloves, remembered elderly relatives' preferences, soothed nervous brides, corrected seating mistakes, carried messages, finished lace, and made herself easy to depend upon. Her father called it steadiness. Florence called it habit. No one called it a life. By noon, St. George's, Hanover Square, was filled with polished boots, silk skirts, restrained whispers, and the quiet satisfaction of families pleased with the match they had helped arrange. Agnes sat where she had been placed and watched the vows without envy. She did not dislike marriage. She disliked the assumption that a woman without it must be waiting for her existence to begin. After the ceremony, the family returned to the Mayfair house, prepared for the wedding breakfast. Flowers crowded the mantelpieces. Silver gleamed beneath the afternoon light. Champagne was poured. Agnes found an extra cushion for an elderly aunt, directed a confused footman toward the correct guest, and quietly prevented a plate containing shellfish from being set before a gentleman who could not eat it. No one noticed. That was the peculiar reward for being indispensable in the correct way. Florence, seated closer to Sir Archibald, received compliments as naturally as sunlight. "You will be next," Lady Hartingford declared, touching Florence's wrist with the edge of her fan. "I can feel it." Florence smiled. "Papa certainly hopes so." Sir Archibald lifted his glass. "Hope is what one relies upon when one has failed to prepare properly. Several guests laughed. Agnes felt his gaze move toward her before he spoke again. My elder daughter, of course, has spared us the expense of such preparations for many years. A gentleman nearby chuckled. Sir Archibald warmed to his own line. Agnes has become our permanent witness to other people's happiness. The laughter that followed was soft, respectable, almost affectionate. Agnes thought that was what made it cruel. A vicious remark shouted across a room could be condemned. A family joke delivered over crystal and flowers was expected to be accepted as proof of good humor. Florence watched her. Sir Archibald waited. Agnes set down her glass. She did not smile. A witness is usually expected to tell the truth, Papa. The laughter thinned. Her father's expression held. And what truth have you discovered? Agnes looked at the bride, who was speaking quietly to her new husband at the far end of the table. Only that marriage and happiness are not interchangeable words. Lady Hartingford became suddenly fascinated by her napkin. Sir Archibald's smile hardened. There is no need to turn a family jest into philosophy. Then perhaps it should remain a better jest. A voice behind Agnes said, "I was wondering when the amusing part would arrive." The room changed. Agnes turned. David Hedworth, Duke of Norchester, stood just inside the open doors. He had clearly arrived later than expected, without the advantage of hearing whatever courtesies had preceded the insult. Tall, dark-haired, dressed with a severity that made ornament seem unnecessary. He possessed the kind of presence that made other people sit differently without being asked. Agnes had seen him only at a distance before. London had made a story of him long before she had any reason to care. 6 years earlier, he had been formally engaged. Shortly before the expected wedding, he had publicly ended it. The woman had vanished from society. David Hedworth had never offered an explanation London considered satisfying. Sir Archibald rose at once. "Your Grace, we had begun to fear you might not come. I said I would." David's tone was calm. "I was delayed." His gaze moved briefly across the table, then settled on Agnes. "Not Florence, Agnes." Sir Archibald gave an accommodating laugh. "You have arrived at the end of a family joke." David looked at Agnes rather than at him. "So I gathered." Florence shifted in her chair. Sir Archibald said, "Agnes is accustomed to our teasing." David did not accept the statement. He asked Agnes instead, "Are you?" It was such a small question that it unsettled her. People often decided what she tolerated and then used her tolerance as permission. Few asked whether endurance had ever been agreement. "One becomes accustomed to English weather, Your Grace," she said. "That doesn't mean one considers every shower delightful." The corner of his mouth moved. Barely. A useful distinction. Something warm flickered beneath Agnes' composure. She ignored it. Sir Archibald immediately redirected conversation toward the wedding, the families, and the season. David answered politely. Yet Agnes remained aware of one fact with uncomfortable clarity. He had heard the cruelty without requiring her to explain it. Later, as guests began moving toward the drawing room, Agnes paused near the terrace doors to retrieve her reticule from a side table. The mother-of-pearl shuttle lay safely inside, wrapped in linen. Behind her, Sir Archibald's voice dropped low enough to suggest privacy. "Do not be foolish about Norchester's reputation," he told Florence. Agnes would have walked on if she had not heard the Duke's name. Florence replied, "You said what happened was dishonorable." "I said it was unfortunate. There is a difference. He ended an engagement days before a wedding, and he remains Duke of Norchester." Sir Archibald's voice softened with impatience. A duchy survives what ordinary men cannot. If he shows interest, you will not throw away an opportunity, because London enjoys an old scandal. Agnes stood very still. There it was, principle measured against advantage. David's supposed dishonor was tolerable if Florence might become a duchess. A moment later, Agnes moved before either of them realized she had heard. In the drawing room, David stood near the mantel, listening to an elderly gentleman speak at length about Parliament. His gaze lifted almost at once when Agnes entered. Recognition passed between them. Nothing more. Agnes gave the smallest inclination of her head. David returned it. She should not have cared. He had done almost nothing. He had not rescued her, contradicted her father, or offered sentimental pity. He had simply refused to call cruelty harmless. For the first time that day, Agnes felt less like an invisible hand arranging other people's happiness and more like a woman standing in full view. Across the room, Sir Archibald drew Florence aside. "Keep your first quadrille free tonight," he murmured. His Grace must be given every opportunity. Florence glanced toward David and smiled. Sir Archibald looked satisfied, as though the evening had already been decided. Agnes closed one hand around the reticule containing her mother's shuttle and looked away before either of them noticed her expression. She had no reason to care whom the Duke of Norchester intended to ask to dance, none at all. But she had already learned one unsettling thing about David Hedworth. He did not always follow the arrangement waiting for him. By 8 o'clock that evening, the same Mayfair house that had held the wedding breakfast had been transformed into candlelight. Music, polished floors, and expectation. The long dining tables were gone. Musicians occupied the gallery above the ballroom doors. Flowers had been rearranged, chairs pushed back, and every mirror appeared determined to multiply the number of people watching one another. Agnes entered beside Florence and Sir Archibald, with the calm of a woman who had already survived the most humiliating portion of the day. Her gown was pale grey silk, elegant without announcing itself. Florence wore soft blue, a colour chosen to brighten her fair hair beneath the chandeliers. Sir Archibald inspected his younger daughter with satisfaction before turning briefly toward Agnes, as though checking that she had not accidentally become interesting. Agnes resisted the temptation to smile. Her mother's mother-of-pearl tatting shuttle remained safely inside the reticule hanging from her wrist. She had considered leaving it at home. Then she had decided that changing her habits because Florence had mocked them would give the mockery more importance than it deserved. Across the ballroom, David Hedworth stood beside an elderly countess whose fan moved almost as quickly as her conversation. He looked much as he had that afternoon. Dark coat, severe tailoring, no unnecessary ornament. Yet Agnes had already seen the faint near smile his public reputation did not account for, and that small private knowledge made him seem less remote. London called him mysterious because it disliked unanswered questions. Agnes had begun to suspect that some questions remained unanswered because society had never earned the answer. Florence followed her gaze and said quietly, "You needn't look so interested." Agnes turned toward her. "Was I? You were looking at him. So are most of the women in this room." Florence's smile remained pleasant for the benefit of anyone watching. Most of them have some reason to. Before Agnes could reply, Sir Archibald joined them. "Florence, remember what I told you." "I remember, Papa. Your first quadrille remains free." Florence glanced toward David, "And if he asks someone else?" Sir Archibald gave a small, confident laugh. He has no reason to. Agnes looked at him. That seems a remarkable amount of certainty to place upon a man who has not yet crossed the room. Her father's expression cooled. Experience teaches one to recognize opportunity. Does it also teach opportunity whom to dance with? Agnes. The warning in his voice was mild because they were in public. Agnes inclined her head as if chastened. Florence touched the pearl at her throat. Papa is only trying to help. Of course. Agnes looked back toward the ballroom. That is often when the greatest trouble begins. The musicians began arranging the first quadrille. Couples shifted into position with the elaborate casualness of people who had planned every movement before arriving. Sir Archibald moved Florence half a step forward. She noticed. Agnes noticed. Several nearby women noticed and pretended not to. David disengaged himself from the Countess and started across the room. Sir Archibald straightened. Florence's expression softened into the carefully opened smile she reserved for men whose admiration mattered. David approached without haste. He bowed first to Sir Archibald. Sir Archibald. Your Grace, I trust the evening finds you less delayed than the afternoon. So far. Sir Archibald smiled as though they shared a private understanding. Florence has very kindly kept her first quadrille free. Florence lowered her eyes at precisely the correct moment. David looked at her. Then he looked at Agnes. The pause lasted only a breath, but Agnes felt the attention around them sharpen. Then I fear Miss Florence will still have it free, David said. I came to ask Miss Agnes. Florence lifted her head. Sir Archibald became completely still. Agnes heard a fan snap shut somewhere behind her. For one dangerous instant, satisfaction rose hot and immediate. She could accept, because Florence had spent all day reminding her that no man would choose her. She could enjoy the humiliation returning in the opposite direction. The impulse shamed her before it had fully formed. If she accepted merely to wound Florence, then Florence would still be deciding the meaning of the moment. Agnes looked at David instead. He had not made the refusal loudly. He had not turned Florence into a spectacle. His attention rested on Agnes and waited. No presumption, no pity. He had crossed the room because he wished to ask her. That was reason enough. Agnes gave him her hand. I should be pleased, Your Grace. Something shifted in David's eyes. Relief, perhaps. It was so restrained she might have imagined it. Sir Archibald recovered first. Of course. Agnes will be delighted. Agnes glanced toward him. I believe I have just said so, Papa. The corner of David's mouth moved. He offered his arm. Agnes placed her gloved hand lightly upon it, and together they crossed toward the forming set. The contact was proper enough to be meaningless. It was not meaningless. She became conscious of the strength beneath the cloth of his sleeve and of the deliberate pace he kept beside her. He neither hurried her nor bent toward her as if they shared a conspiracy. The awareness annoyed her by being impossible to dismiss. When the music began, they took their positions. You have disappointed my father, Agnes said under the cover of the first movement. Have I? He had arranged the evening with great confidence. Then I regret the injury to his confidence. Agnes looked at him. You do not sound regretful. I have been told my voice is unreliable in matters of repentance. By whom? A surprisingly large portion of London. The figure separated them. When the pattern returned them to one another, his gaze was already waiting. Agnes felt something unfamiliar tighten low in her chest. Not fear, not even vanity. Recognition, perhaps, because David appeared to listen even before she spoke. You dislike arrangements, she said. Those made before I arrive. Only those? His brow lifted. you suspect a broader objection. Society arranges women's futures before they arrive all the time, sometimes before they are old enough to understand there is an arrangement. David's expression changed. Then perhaps my objection is less original than I imagined. Most male discoveries about society are. For one startled beat, he simply looked at her. Then a low laugh escaped him. Agnes felt an absurd flicker of triumph. The dance carried them apart again. When their gloved hands met, as the figure required, the contact lasted no longer than etiquette allowed. Yet the second time it happened, both seemed to anticipate it. Agnes felt the faint pressure of his palm through the kid leather. Then the immediate absence when the movement separated them. There was nothing improper in it. That was precisely why the awareness felt so sharp. She had danced with men before. She had taken arms, offered hands, stood within formal distances, ordained by custom. None of those gestures had ever seemed to contain a question. David returned beside her as the set changed. "You heard something about me today," he said quietly. Agnes thought of Sir Archibald's words after the wedding breakfast. "A duchy survives what ordinary men cannot. I heard that London remembers an old engagement." His face gave away nothing. London remembers selectively. "My father seems willing to forget it when convenient." David glanced toward Sir Archibald, who was watching them from the edge of the floor. Convenience is a powerful editor. Agnes looked at him. "Should I be frightened? Of me? Of whatever everyone thinks I ought to know?" The dance required another turn. David waited until they came together again. "You will hear unkind things about me." "I already have." "Then I should be precise." His voice lowered, not conspiratorially, but because the words belonged to her rather than the room. "Some of them are true in fact and false in meaning." Agnes held his gaze. "That sounds like a distinction designed to create more questions." "It is. Do you intend to answer them?" "Some. And the others?" Something guarded entered his expression. "That will depend upon whether the answers belong only to me." The musicians carried them apart before Agnes could ask more. The line stayed with her. Not whether he wished to tell her, whether the answers belonged only to him. By the time the quadrille ended, the ballroom seemed louder than before. David returned Agnes properly to the edge of the floor. Florence stood several yards away beside Lady Hartingford, surrounded by conversation and listening to none of it. Her gaze was fixed on Agnes. Sir Archibald approached. "A successful opening, I trust." "Very," David said. Sir Archibald smiled. "Perhaps Florence might have the next." David did not answer immediately. He looked toward Florence, then back to Sir Archibald. "I believe Miss Florence should choose her next partner according to her own wishes." The courtesy was faultless. So was the refusal to be managed. Florence smiled because the room required it. Agnes could see the effort. David turned back to her. "Thank you for the dance, Miss Lethbridge." "Thank you for asking, Your Grace." His gaze remained on hers for one beat longer than necessity demanded. Then he bowed and moved away. Florence waited until he was safely beyond hearing. "You look pleased with yourself." Agnes met her eyes. "I enjoyed a dance. With the Duke." "Yes, he appears to have been present." "Don't pretend this means nothing." "I am not pretending anything." Florence's composure cracked by a fraction. "He was meant to ask me. According to Papa, according to sense." Agnes thought of David's warning. True in fact, false in meaning. She thought of how confidently everyone around them arranged value, marriage, scandal, and reputation until human beings fit the expected pattern. "Perhaps," Agnes said, "His Grace dislikes having his intentions decided before he arrives." Florence's face hardened. "And perhaps you are mistaking curiosity for preference." The remark was designed to send Agnes back into the familiar role of the woman who should not hope. It almost worked. Then Agnes remembered why she had accepted the dance. Not because David was a duke, not because Florence had wanted him, because Agnes herself had wanted those few minutes beside a man who listened before deciding what she meant. "Perhaps," she said calmly, "but I did not ask him to cross the room." She left Florence before the exchange could become another performance. Near the open terrace doors, cool night air reached her face. Agnes was 34. She knew one quadrille promised nothing. She knew a duke's attention could vanish as easily as it appeared. None of that altered what had happened. David Hedworth had been offered the arrangement everyone expected him to follow, and he had chosen differently. More unsettling still, Agnes had chosen too, and as his words returned to her once more, she understood that the question waiting beyond the dance was no longer why the mysterious Duke had crossed the ballroom for her. It was what truth could be factual enough to condemn a man, and incomplete enough to make that condemnation wrong. 2 days after the wedding, at 11:30 in the morning, the Duke of Norchester's card arrived at Lethbridge House on a silver salver, and Sir Archibald reacted as though the entire purpose of the previous evening had been fulfilled exactly according to his design. "Show his grace in at once," he told the butler, although the man was already turning toward the door. Florence sat near the drawing-room window in a pale green morning gown, with embroidery arranged across her lap. Agnes had watched her hold the same needle above the same flower for nearly 10 minutes. Their father had spent most of breakfast explaining that a gentleman of David Hedworth's rank should never feel pursued, which seemed to Agnes a remarkable principle from a man who had spent the previous evening attempting to place Florence directly in the Duke's path. Agnes sat opposite her sister with a book open in her hands. Her mother's mother-of-pearl tatting shuttle rested inside the reticule beside her chair. She had read perhaps 3 pages since breakfast and remembered none of them. That irritated her more than she wished to admit. A single quadrille should not have altered her concentration. Neither should a single sentence spoken beneath ballroom music. Some things are true in fact and false in meaning. Yet the words had followed her home. When David entered, he bowed first to Sir Archibald, then to Florence and Agnes. "Sir Archibald, Miss Florence, Miss Lethbridge." His gaze remained on Agnes for one quiet beat longer than courtesy required. Agnes felt the awareness immediately and resented the speed of it. "Your Grace," Sir Archibald said warmly, "you honor us. I said I would call." David's tone was calm. Sir Archibald smiled, as though the promise itself confirmed something flattering about his household. Naturally, Florence was only saying this morning how much she enjoyed the reception. Florence looked up with flawless composure. "It was a beautiful evening." "Was it?" David asked. Florence hesitated. "Surely your Grace thought so. Parts of it." Agnes lowered her book before the smile reached her mouth. David noticed. Sir Archibald noticed him noticing. "Florence," her father said, "you might tell his Grace about Lady Winthrop's concert. You spoke very highly of it." Florence required no further encouragement. She described the soprano, the program, the flowers, and several people who had apparently dressed in colors she considered personally offensive. David listened with correct attention when she finished by mentioning another musicale planned for the following week. Sir Archibald leaned back with satisfaction. clearly expecting an invitation to emerge from the opening he had created. David turned instead to Agnes. "Do you enjoy music, Miss Lethbridge?" Florence's embroidery needle stopped. Agnes closed her book. "Very much." "Opera." When the audience remembers it hasn't been engaged to compete with the performers. A flicker of amusement appeared in his eyes. "That seems an ambitious standard." "I am told I have unrealistic expectations. By London, by people with louder voices." This time his mouth actually moved toward a smile. Sir Archibald gave a short laugh that arrived late enough to reveal obligation rather than amusement. "Agnes has always had a dry turn." "So I have discovered," David said. The simple approval in his voice warmed her more than it should have. Sir Archibald tried again. He spoke of Florence's singing lessons. David responded politely. He mentioned an exhibition recently opened in Mayfair and asked Agnes whether she had seen it. Sir Archibald offered Florence's opinion on landscape painting. David asked Agnes whether she agreed. After 15 minutes, the pattern became impossible to ignore. David was not rude to Florence. That would have embarrassed Agnes as much as her sister. He merely refused to allow Sir Archibald to choose where his attention belonged. Agnes began to understand that his restraint was not passivity. It could be an extraordinarily precise form of refusal. A message arrived for Sir Archibald, requiring him briefly in the hall. He left the drawing-room door open and reminded Florence to pour tea. Nothing improper could be alleged. Florence placed a cup before David. "1 lump or 2, Your Grace." "Neither, thank you. How austere, only in tea." Agnes looked down too late. David saw the laugh she had tried to hide. Florence saw it too. "You two seem to find a surprising amount amusing." Agnes raised her eyes. David answered before she could. "Your sister has an efficient sense of the ridiculous." "That may be the least flattering compliment I have ever received," Agnes said. "I was not aware I was flattering you." "Then I fear your reputation for mystery may be justified." The words changed the air. Florence became very still. David did not. His expression sharpened with attention rather than offense. "Do you understand my reputation, Miss Lethbridge?" "No." Agnes set her book aside. "I said it may be justified. That is not the same thing." A useful distinction. She recognized the echo of their first conversation, and so did he. Florence placed the teapot down. London has never lacked explanations for his grace. David's gaze remained on Agnes. London rarely lacks explanations. Facts are often less convenient. Agnes heard again the quadrille music in memory, true in fact and false in meaning. She had no wish to play at coyness. He had crossed the ballroom for her. He had warned her. If he wanted her to decide what she believed, then she would ask what he meant. "Was your warning last night intended to frighten me away?" Florence drew a soft breath. David answered immediately. "No. Then what did you intend?" "To give you the choice of asking before someone else decided what you ought to believe." Agnes studied him. "I am asking." David glanced once toward Florence, not with fear, with calculation of a different sort. Agnes understood that whatever he guarded was not merely embarrassment. He reached inside his coat and withdrew a folded document protected within a plain wrapper. He did not place it on the table. He did not offer it to Agnes. He held it carefully in one hand. "This is a certified extract from a parish marriage register dated 1852. Agnes looked at the folded paper. The words should have clarified something. Instead, they opened an entirely new question. "Whose marriage?" she asked. "I cannot tell you that." Florence gave a faint, incredulous laugh. "Then it proves very little." David turned to her. At present, to you, it proves nothing." The lack of defensiveness seemed to unsettle Florence. He returned his attention to Agnes. "The document could answer much of what is said about me, but the answer includes another person's private life." Agnes looked at the wrapper, then at him. "And you will not let me read it?" "No, even though showing it might clear your reputation, especially for that reason." Something in his face hardened, not against Agnes, but against the thought itself. "I won't purchase my reputation with her exposure." The room became unexpectedly quiet. Agnes thought of every drawing room in which a woman's mistake, disappointment, refusal, engagement, marriage, or absence could become entertainment before she had any right to object. She thought of how easily Florence had repeated London's judgment, because everyone assumed the woman in David's scandal belonged to the story more than she belonged to herself. "Do you expect me to trust what I cannot see?" Agnes asked. "No." His answer came without hesitation. That surprised her. "Then what do you expect?" "Nothing you haven't chosen to give." Agnes held his gaze. There was no grand defense in his manner, no invocation of rank, no demand that his refusal be admired simply because it sounded honorable. "I won't demand another woman's privacy as the price of knowing you," Agnes said slowly. Something in David's expression eased. "Thank you," she continued before relief could become conclusion. "But that does not mean I can promise you unlimited trust, while part of the truth remains closed." The softness vanished from his face, replaced by sober attention. "I wouldn't ask you to. Not now. Not later either." Agnes considered that. People often say such things before later becomes inconvenient. A trace of dry humor returned to his eyes. "Then you may remind me when I become unbearable." "I had intended to do that regardless." The smile came then, small, real, gone quickly. It changed nothing about the mystery. Somehow it changed the distance between them. Sir Archibald returned before either could say more. His gaze dropped at once to the folded document in David's hand. "Business, Your Grace." David slipped the paper back inside his coat. "No. Something concerning my family? No." Sir Archibald clearly disliked both answers. He resumed his seat and attempted to turn the conversation toward Florence once more. But Agnes barely heard him. She now knew David possessed a certified record connected somehow to the scandal of 1852. She knew it concerned another person's marriage. She knew he believed it could answer much of London's accusation. She did not know whose marriage it recorded, what date mattered, or why using it would expose a woman he still protected 6 years later. When David rose at the proper end of the call, he bowed to Sir Archibald and Florence before turning to Agnes. "Miss Lethbridge, Your Grace, may I call again?" Agnes did not glance at her father. "You may." David bowed once and left. The front door had scarcely closed below before Florence dropped her embroidery into her lap. "You cannot seriously find that reassuring." Agnes picked up her book, though she no longer knew what page she had been reading. "I did not say I found it reassuring." "He carries a document he claims could explain everything and refuses to show it." Florence leaned forward. Anyone can hide behind honor when no one is permitted to inspect the truth. Agnes looked at her. Florence's expression had lost its social sweetness. "If there were an honorable explanation," she said, "do you really think it would need 6 years of silence?" Agnes did not answer. That was the difficulty. Florence's question was cruelly phrased, but it was not foolish. Agnes knew only that David Hedworth possessed evidence he refused to spend, and that his refusal had made her respect him at exactly the same moment it gave her another reason not to trust him yet. 2 days later, Hyde Park gave Agnes the illusion of privacy without ever permitting the fact of it. Carriages rolled along Rotten Row in a slow procession of polished harness and carefully displayed elegance. Riders passed beneath the young summer leaves. Ladies walked in pairs or small groups, all of them appearing absorbed in conversation while observing everyone else with practiced efficiency. Mrs. Bellamy, Agnes's maternal aunt, walked several paces behind with an elderly acquaintance whose opinions about a recent charity subscription seemed capable of sustaining an entire afternoon. Agnes was grateful for the arrangement. It allowed propriety without forcing intimacy into secrecy. David walked beside her at an easy pace, neither hurrying nor directing her. When the path narrowed near a line of waiting carriages, he offered his arm. Agnes accepted because the footing required it, and because refusing ordinary courtesy merely to prove independence would have been another sort of performance. Her gloved hand rested lightly against his sleeve. Nothing in the gesture was new. She had taken gentlemen's arms before, yet after the quadrille and his formal call, she had become inconveniently aware of the difference between contact required by custom and attention freely given. "You have been quiet for nearly 3 minutes," David said. Agnes looked ahead. "I did not realize my silence had become measurable. I have begun to notice it. That sounds dangerous in a man with your reputation." "You continue to make excellent use of my reputation. It saves me the trouble of inventing material." His mouth shifted toward a smile. Across the drive, Florence rode in Lady Hartingford's carriage and lifted one hand in greeting. Agnes returned it. Florence's gaze moved from Agnes's face to the hand resting on David's arm, then back again. The gesture was entirely proper. Florence, nevertheless, looked as though propriety itself had committed a betrayal. David followed Agnes's glance. "Your sister does not appear pleased to see us. Florence is happiest when events resemble what she expected. And I have disappointed her expectations. Repeatedly, a grave habit. I suspect you will survive it." He glanced at her. "A duchy survives what ordinary men cannot, I am told." Agnes nearly stopped walking. The words were her father's, spoken after the wedding breakfast, when Sir Archibald had believed David might choose Florence. She had not intended to repeat them. David noticed her reaction. "That was not my invention," he said. "No." Agnes looked toward the passing carriages. "My father said it to Florence. He meant that whatever happened in your old engagement was tolerable if you were still in a position to make her a duchess." David's expression cooled, not with anger, but with thought. "And now that you have not followed the intended arrangement, he appears less generous about your history." "Convenient. My father has always preferred principles that cooperate with advantage." For a few steps, neither spoke. Then David said, "You say that as though you have been disappointed by him too many times to be surprised." Agnes considered denying it. Instead, she said, "Surprise requires expectation." His gaze turned toward her. There was no pity in it. She appreciated that more than sympathy. The path widened, and Agnes withdrew her hand from his arm. The absence of contact was immediate enough that she noticed it, and irritating enough that she ignored the fact. David let several moments pass before speaking again. "May I ask you something personal?" "You may ask. That is not the same as agreeing to answer. You are learning, slowly." Agnes looked at him. He did not ask the question. Society usually asked unmarried women once politeness gave way to curiosity. He did not ask why no one had married her. He did not ask whether she had ever been disappointed. Instead, he said, "Did you ever want to marry?" The simplicity of it unsettled her. Agnes looked toward the Serpentine, where sunlight flashed between the trees. Yes, David gave no sign of surprise. Once, seriously. She folded her hands before her as they walked. His name was Mr. Harcourt. He was respectable, sensible. My father approved of him. That last quality sounds ominous. Agnes looked at him, and the dry note in his voice surprised a small laugh from her. In retrospect, it should have been. David smiled fully then. Not the near smile she had seen at the wedding breakfast. Not the restrained amusement of the quadrille. A genuine laugh warmed his face and made him look younger. Less like the man London had reduced to a scandal, and more like someone who had once known how to be unguarded. Agnes nearly missed a step, David noticed. "Careful. I am perfectly steady." "I was. By what?" She considered a polite answer and rejected it. "You." His brows rose. "That sounds promising. Do not be encouraged." It was not a compliment. "I shall recover. Your duchy may assist." His laughter returned, quieter this time, and Agnes found herself smiling in spite of every sensible intention she possessed. When the moment settled, David asked, "What happened with Mr. Harcourt?" Agnes's smile faded without disappearing entirely. "My mother was gravely ill then. She needed help most days. More than help, perhaps. She needed someone she trusted not to make her feel burdensome." David's expression became attentive. "You?" "Yes." Agnes looked ahead. "Mr. Harcourt proposed. He expected us to marry quickly and leave London almost at once for Surrey. He knew about your mother." "Perfectly. And he expected you to go. He believed marriage created new priorities." David was silent. Agnes continued, before his silence could become judgment on a man who was not there to answer. "He was not cruel. That would make the story easier. He simply believed a wife should place her husband first, and he had no desire to begin marriage waiting upon an illness that did not concern him." "And you did not love him?" Agnes looked at David. "No. I respected him. I thought perhaps respect might grow into something warmer. But when he asked me to leave my mother before she was ready to be left, I realized I did not trust the life he was offering." "So you refused?" "Yes." The answer still carried the faint pressure of years of other people's disappointment, but not shame. "My father called it foolish. Mr. Harcourt called it unrealistic." Florence was young enough to hear every version except mine. In time, the story became simpler. Agnes had been proposed to. Something went wrong, and no one else stayed. David's gaze held hers. "Then unmarried was not something that happened to you." Agnes stopped. He stopped as well. Mrs. Bellamy remained several yards behind, still absorbed in the charity discussion and near enough for propriety. Agnes looked at David. The sentence had reached a place she had protected so long that she had forgotten it could still hurt. Not because it was cruel, because it was accurate. "No," she said, "it was something I accepted rather than marry badly." David did not praise her courage. He did not call it sacrifice. He simply nodded, as if her choice required no excuse. "Do you regret it?" "No." The answer came easily. "I regretted disappointing people. I regretted that my mother blamed herself for part of it. I regretted how quickly everyone decided refusal meant I had been too difficult to love. But I never regretted saying no." "Why did you stop correcting them?" Agnes resumed walking. "Because explanation became another form of begging." David's expression changed. "Begging for what?" "For permission to believe my own decision was respectable." She gave a small shrug. "Eventually, I became tired of presenting evidence for my dignity." The words, evidence, hung between them for a heartbeat, and both knew there was another document neither of them would discuss today. Agnes had seen it. She knew it was a certified marriage register extract from 1852. She knew no more. David did not use the opening to explain. She respected that, even as the mystery remained. People prefer simple stories, he said. Yes, families especially. Agnes glanced at him. You sound experienced. I am experienced in being simplified. The answer was quiet. Before she could ask more, a familiar voice called her name. Florence had left Lady Hartingford's carriage and now approached with another young woman. Her smile was bright enough to convince anyone who did not know her. Agnes. How fortunate. Agnes waited. Florence's gaze flicked toward David. Lady Eleanor was just saying how remarkable it is that you have suddenly discovered such enthusiasm for society. Lady Eleanor looked immediately uncomfortable. Agnes said, Did she? Florence continued, You never wanted any of this before. The sentence came out sharper than the smile surrounding it. Dances, park drives, attention. For the first time, Agnes heard something beneath the jealousy. Not only resentment, disorientation. Florence had known how to be the beautiful younger sister because Agnes had always occupied the opposite place. I did not want to be arranged, Agnes said. That is not the same as wanting nothing. Florence's expression flickered. Everything was simpler before. Agnes felt the truth hidden inside the complaint. For whom? Florence had no answer. David remained silent beside Agnes, giving her the space to answer for herself. Lady Eleanor looked between the sisters and wisely pretended to admire a passing horse. Florence recovered first. I only mean you have always claimed independence. Independence does not require refusing company, Agnes said. It requires choosing it. David's eyes warmed. A useful distinction, he said. Agnes looked at him. You are becoming repetitive, Your Grace. I was about to accuse you of the same thing, she laughed. So did he. Florence's smile vanished for one unguarded instant. Agnes saw it clearly now. Her sister was not merely angry that David preferred Agnes's company. She was frightened by what that preference disturbed. If Agnes was not the unwanted sister, then Florence no longer knew exactly what being the chosen one meant. Agnes felt no triumph in the realization, only sadness and a new certainty that she would not make herself smaller to restore Florence's comfort. Mrs. Bellamy approached, and the social moment broke naturally. David offered his arm again where the path narrowed. Agnes accepted. This time she understood something she had not known when they began walking. David had learned that her unmarried life was not an empty space waiting for him to fill. She had chosen once, she could choose again. Beside her, he walked in thoughtful silence, and Agnes found herself wondering what decision in his own past had taught him to recognize the cost of being misunderstood. 2 days later, the private exhibition at Lady Marchmont's Mayfair house gave Agnes exactly the sort of setting she preferred for seeing David again. It was crowded enough to make privacy impossible and intimate enough to make every glance matter. Paintings from several family collections lined the long gallery. Marble figures stood beneath high windows. Guests moved slowly from one work to another with the solemn concentration of people who had decided their opinions must be visible. Mrs. Bellamy accompanied Agnes and remained near enough to satisfy every rule of propriety while possessing the rare good sense not to hover. Florence arrived separately with Lady Hartingford and 2 younger women, her expression composed enough that only Agnes noticed how quickly her sister searched the room. David was already there. He stood before a landscape beside an elderly gentleman. who was explaining, at unnecessary length, why the painter had misunderstood English weather. David listened with admirable restraint. Then he saw Agnes. Nothing dramatic changed. He did not abandon the conversation or cross the gallery with theatrical purpose, yet something in his face eased, and Agnes felt the recognition before he approached. Mrs. Bellamy saw it too. "His Grace appears relieved that the exhibition has improved," she murmured. Agnes looked at her. "Aunt, I said nothing improper. You implied it. That is how civilized conversation survives." David reached them before Agnes could answer. He bowed first to Mrs. Bellamy. "Mrs. Bellamy, Your Grace." Her aunt gave him the direct look she reserved for men she considered potentially interesting and therefore potentially troublesome. David then turned to Agnes. "Miss Lethbridge, Your Grace, have you found anything worth defending?" Agnes glanced toward the nearest portrait, which depicted a severe gentleman standing beside a horse with considerably more intelligence in its eyes. The horse. David looked at the painting. "I had the same concern." Mrs. Bellamy's mouth twitched. "I shall inspect the miniatures before the crowd becomes intolerable. Agnes, His Grace may walk with you, provided you both remember that I can see farther than either of you imagines." David said gravely, "I have no wish to test the limits of your vision." "Wise, Mrs." Bellamy moved away. David offered his arm. Agnes accepted. The gesture was ordinary, but neither treated it as entirely meaningless. They moved along the gallery while conversation rose and fell around them. Florence stood across the room with Lady Hartingford, apparently listening to another woman while watching Agnes with much greater attention. David noticed, "Your sister appears to be observing us." Florence considers observation a duty when events refuse to behave. "And have they?" Repeatedly, his mouth curved. They stopped before a large painting of a storm-dark coast. Agnes studied the tiny figures painted near the edge of the sea. "Do you like it?" David asked. "I think it is working very hard to make suffering picturesque." He turned his head toward her. "That sounds like criticism of more than painting." "Perhaps." Agnes kept her gaze on the canvas. "Do you think London would forgive you more easily if you told it a prettier version of whatever happened 6 years ago?" David did not pretend not to understand. "Yes." The answer came so quickly that she looked at him. "That simple?" "Very. You could lie. I could. You could say the woman was unstable, or faithless, or that her family deceived you. Society likes explanations in which the absent person cannot answer." Something in David's expression hardened. Exactly. Agnes had not expected such immediate agreement. Then why not use one? "Because a lie would make me easier to forgive by making someone else easier to condemn." The gallery seemed louder around them for a moment. Agnes thought of the folded, certified marriage register extract he had shown her at Lethbridge House. She knew it existed. She knew it concerned another person's marriage and the scandal of 1852. She did not know whose marriage it recorded or why the date mattered. "And the truth?" she asked. "The truth is more complicated." "Because it belongs partly to someone else." "Yes." They resumed walking. Agnes became aware of how often people glanced toward them. A week earlier, many of those same guests would have passed over her without thought. Now, a duke's attention had made her visible in ways she did not entirely enjoy. She had spent years resenting the assumption that no man's choice confirmed her worth. She disliked discovering that society's opposite mistake could be just as insulting. "You have gone quiet again," David said. Agnes looked at him. "You are developing a concerning interest in my silences. I have become attentive to them." That is nearly a threat. I intended it as concern. Worse, he laughed softly. The sound warmed her despite herself. What were you thinking? He asked. Agnes considered refusing the question. Then she decided she had become tired of protecting everyone from the truth of her own thoughts. That society is suddenly interested in me because you are. David's expression lost its amusement. I am sorry. You needn't be. You did not invent the habit. No, but I am contributing to it. Agnes glanced toward a group of ladies who looked away a fraction too late. Perhaps. Does that make you wish I would stop? The question was quiet and entirely serious. Agnes looked at him. He was not asking whether gossip bothered her. He was asking whether his attention did. No, something changed in his face. Agnes continued before the answer could become larger than she intended. But I will not pretend the situation is simple. I respect why you refuse to explain everything. I respect it very much. That sounds like the beginning of a qualification. It is. They reached a stone balustrade overlooking a lower sculpture court. Behind them, a group had gathered near the next set of paintings, narrowing the passage. Agnes rested one gloved hand lightly on the balustrade while they waited. Respect is not the same as readiness, she said. David remained beside her, close enough that she could feel his attention but not crowded by it. Readiness for what? Agnes turned toward him. To marry a mystery. The words were quiet. She did not know Florence had approached the adjoining gallery until a faint rustle of skirts sounded beyond the nearby archway. David's gaze shifted briefly past Agnes's shoulder. She followed it and saw Florence several yards away beside Lady Hartingford, apparently studying a watercolor. Apparently, Florence's face had gone very still. Agnes knew at once that her sister had heard at least part of the sentence. David seemed to understand the same thing. He did not move Agnes away, or lower his voice as though they had been caught doing something shameful. He simply said, I would never ask you to marry what you do not understand. Agnes held his gaze. Would you ask me to trust it? Only as far as I have earned. The answer reached her with more force than reassurance should have. The crowd behind them shifted closer, forcing several guests toward the balustrade. Agnes moved slightly to make room. David's attention dropped to her hand resting on the stone. For the first time since she had known him, hesitation entered his face in a way that had nothing to do with scandal. Personal. Careful. May I? He asked softly. Agnes understood what he meant. Her pulse changed. No one else would have considered the gesture significant. A gloved hand beneath another gloved hand in a crowded gallery was hardly a declaration. Yet, because he had asked, the choice became visible between them. Agnes looked at him. There was no assumption in his expression, no expectation that rank, courtship, or earlier dance contact entitled him to anything more. You may, she said. David placed his hand gently over hers. The touch was brief and perfectly still. He did not close his fingers around her hand. He did not draw her closer. Warmth traveled through 2 layers of leather with an absurd clarity. Agnes became conscious of the shape of his hand, the steadiness of him beside her, the fact that intention had been spoken before contact. She did not move her hand away. That was her answer after the first answer. David's gaze remained on her face. For several seconds, the gallery seemed to narrow around the quiet between them. Then someone laughed loudly behind them, and the passage cleared. David lifted his hand. Agnes felt the loss of contact immediately and disliked how much she noticed it. Thank you, he said. She looked at him. For what? Not pretending the question did not matter. You asked it as though it did. It did. The simplicity of the reply made her heartbeat stumble more effectively than flattery could have. Agnes stepped away from the balustrade. Across the gallery, Florence was no longer pretending to study the watercolor. She was watching them openly now. Lady Hartingford said something to her, but Florence barely responded. Agnes knew that expression. Her sister had not heard an entire conversation. She had heard enough, not ready to marry a mystery. It was exactly the kind of fragment Florence could repeat without technically lying. Mrs. Bellamy reappeared near the archway with the expression of a woman who had seen everything and intended to mention none of it unless necessary. David offered his arm again. Agnes accepted. As they crossed toward her aunt, she said quietly, "Florence heard me." "Yes, probably only part. That is usually the more dangerous quantity." Agnes glanced at him. "You do understand society, after all, against my better judgment. She may repeat it." David looked toward Florence once, then back at Agnes. "Then we shall discover what happens when half a truth is given ambition." Agnes should have felt only dread. Instead, she was still aware of the vanished warmth over her hand. That troubled her more. Florence might turn one sentence into gossip by tomorrow. Agnes could not control that. What she could control was the fact that when David Hedworth had wanted to touch her, he had asked, and when Agnes had wanted him to, she had said yes. By the 9th day of their acquaintance, Agnes had discovered that uncertainty could become intimate long before it became comfortable. Mrs. Bellamy's drawing room was smaller than the grand rooms of Lethbridge House and far less interested in impressing anyone. The June light fell across faded carpet, polished wood, and a tea table arranged without ceremony. Two elderly ladies occupied the far end of the room with a discussion about a charity subscription. Mrs. Bellamy sat near the window, answering correspondence, close enough to satisfy propriety and sensible enough not to pretend that Agnes and David could not conduct a private conversation within her hearing. Agnes sat with a narrow strip of linen across her lap and her mother's mother-of-pearl tatting shuttle resting between her fingers. She had brought it without thinking, or perhaps she had thought more than she wished to admit. The gossip created from Florence's overheard fragment had already reached Mrs. Bellamy in two different forms. In one version, Agnes had declared she would never marry the Duke of Norchester. In another, she had told him directly that no respectable woman could trust a man with his reputation. Both versions had been delivered by people who appeared deeply concerned for accuracy. Agnes had corrected neither. She had grown tired of chasing sentences once other people had decided what they preferred them to mean. When David entered at 3, he bowed first to Mrs. Bellamy, then to Agnes. His gaze fell briefly to the shuttle in her hand. "I have seen that before." Agnes looked down. "At the wedding breakfast. You were holding it after your father's joke." The fact that he remembered surprised her. "It belonged to my mother." David took the chair opposite her. "She taught you, eventually." "That does not sound like a simple answer." Agnes smiled faintly. "It was not. I was dreadful at first. I tangled thread around everything except the shuttle." "That is reassuring." She looked at him. "Why? You have the irritating appearance of someone who was born competent." Agnes lifted one eyebrow. "Your Grace, that may be the least romantic compliment I have ever received. I wasn't aware I had promised romance." "Then your failure is complete." A quiet laugh escaped him. Mrs. Bellamy glanced over her spectacles, saw the expression on Agnes's face, and returned deliberately to her correspondence. Agnes turned the shuttle once between her fingers. My mother used to say patience was skill practiced slowly. David's expression softened. You miss her. It was not really a question. Agnes looked at the pale shell in her hand. Yes. Years had changed grief from an open wound into something quieter, but certain objects still seemed capable of shortening time. She believed I could learn almost anything if I stopped being angry that I didn't already know it. A useful philosophy, one I resented when I was 14. Naturally. David looked at the shuttle again. I understand why you carry it. Do you? Objects become difficult to misplace when the person attached to them is already gone. Agnes stopped moving the thread. The words were simple and unexpectedly exact. She looked at him, and for a moment neither of them had anything witty to hide behind. You are better at saying difficult things than your reputation suggests, she said. Only when they belong to someone else. The answer shifted the air between them. Agnes placed the shuttle carefully on the linen. Florence has been repeating what she heard at the exhibition. I assumed she would. Apparently, I have refused you 3 times in 2 days. That is efficient. She has always been industrious when motivated. David smiled, but the humor faded quickly. What she heard was not wrong. No. Agnes folded her hands in her lap. It was incomplete, which is often more useful. She studied him. You said in Hyde Park that you had experience being simplified. I do. And at the exhibition, you said the truth would condemn someone else if you used it carelessly. David's face became still. Agnes did not push immediately. She had no desire to force open the door he had already told her was not entirely his. Still, there was a difference between demanding a name and asking whether the man beside her understood the cost of the silence he chose. I do not need the woman's identity, she said. I'm not asking for it. David looked at her for several seconds. Thank you. But I do need to understand what sort of choice you made. He glanced toward the window, where carriage wheels passed beyond the glass. When he answered, his voice had lost some of its habitual polish. 6 years ago, there was a woman everyone expected me to marry. Agnes remained quiet. She did not want the life arranged for her, he continued. Not because she was foolish. Not because she had suddenly become capricious. She wanted another life. And by the time I understood that, matters had become dangerous for her. Dangerous how? Socially, financially. Her family had enough influence to make disobedience costly. Agnes thought of Sir Archibald and his quieter forms of pressure, and telling the truth would have helped them. Yes. David rested one hand beside his untouched teacup. If I defended myself publicly, I would have had to explain why the engagement ended and what she had chosen instead. That would have given people information they had no right to possess. Agnes thought of the certified marriage register extract she had seen at Lethbridge House. She still did not know whose marriage it recorded, only that David believed it could answer much of the scandal. So you accepted the blame. I accepted the appearance of it. His mouth tightened. After enough years, the distinction became less useful. Why did you never correct people later? David looked down at his hand. The pause that followed was not evasive. It felt like a man sorting truth from habit. At first, because I had given my word. Later, because silence became easier than explaining why I had chosen it. Agnes said nothing. He continued. I learned to think that carrying blame quietly was always the honorable thing. The confession landed without self-pity. That was what made it difficult to hear. David was not presenting himself as a martyr. He was admitting that something once principled had hardened into a rule he no longer knew how to question. Agnes looked at him carefully. Sometimes silence protects. Yes. Sometimes it merely chooses who must live with the uncertainty. His gaze lifted to hers. She did not soften the sentence. If you ask me to know you more closely while a part of your past remains closed, then your silence no longer affects only you. David absorbed that without defense. I know, do you? I am beginning to. The honesty in his answer loosened something in her. He shifted one hand from beside his cup and rested it between them, palm upward. He did not reach for her. May I ask you for something selfish? Agnes looked at his offered hand. You may ask. Would you sit with me in the uncertainty a little longer? Her heart tightened. Not forever. No, and not because you think your intentions should be enough. No, and not because you are a duke. A faint smile touched his mouth, especially not for that reason. Agnes let the silence stretch long enough to make the choice entirely hers. Then she placed her hand in his. David's fingers closed gently around hers. The touch was different from the brief moment at the exhibition. Then he had asked permission to touch her. Now, he had admitted that he needed reassurance and left her free to refuse it. Agnes felt the steadiness of his hand through her glove. He did not pull her closer. He simply held on. She tightened her fingers once. Something in his expression gave way. Not control. Loneliness. The recognition affected her more than any dramatic declaration could have. Around them, ordinary life continued. Mrs. Bellamy turned a page. One of the elderly ladies complained about subscription lists. A carriage rattled past the window. The world did not pause because Agnes held a duke's hand that made the moment feel more intimate, not less. You are very practiced at being relied upon, Agnes said softly. I have had time. You are less accomplished at allowing the reverse. I suspected that might be the lesson. One of them. His thumb moved once against the side of her glove, a restrained acknowledgement rather than a caress. Your mother would approve of your teaching method. Agnes smiled. She would tell you patience is skill practiced slowly. I am beginning to dislike how applicable that sounds. Good. It means you are learning. David laughed under his breath. They remained hand in hand for several more quiet seconds before Agnes released him. He let her go immediately. Neither pretended the moment had been accidental. A footman entered, carrying several newly delivered cards. Mrs. Bellamy sorted them, then paused over one. Agnes. She held it out. Lady Hartingford's box party. Thursday evening. Agnes took the card. The embossed name beneath the invitation was unmistakable. Her Majesty's Theatre. She looked at David. The warmth had left his expression. You know who will be there, she said. Yes, people who remember 1852. Very clearly. Agnes glanced down at the invitation again. The mystery had moved closer, without revealing itself. She still did not know the woman's name, the marriage recorded on the sealed extract, or why its date mattered. She knew only that David had once chosen silence to protect someone else, and that tomorrow's gossip might force that old choice into the light before either of them was ready. By the 11th day, Agnes had begun to understand that scandal did not require truth in order to survive. It required only repetition, an audience, and one person willing to speak with confidence before anyone else had decided what to believe. Her Majesty's Theatre glittered beneath gaslight and gilt, its boxes crowded with silk, black coats, jeweled hair, and the carefully controlled excitement of people who had come as much to observe one another as the performance. Lady Hartingford's box was positioned well enough to make Agnes visible from several neighboring boxes, which Florence seemed to regard as an advantage. Mrs. Bellamy sat beside Agnes with her fan closed across her lap. Sir Archibald occupied the chair nearest the outer rail. Florence had already greeted 3 acquaintances before the curtain rose and accepted 2 compliments on her gown. David was seated in a neighboring box with an older gentleman. Agnes did not know. He had bowed to her when she arrived. Nothing more. The restraint should have been ordinary. Instead, Agnes felt the absence of their last quiet hand-holding with uncomfortable precision. She had told him uncertainty could not last forever. Tonight, surrounded by people who remembered 6 years ago better than they remembered their own errors, she suspected that uncertainty had decided to test its limits. The first act passed without incident. During the interval, several guests moved between neighboring boxes and the corridor beyond them. Lady Hartingford welcomed 2 women Agnes recognized from the exhibition, and a gentleman who had spent much of the previous season repeating stories about men he claimed not to respect. The group was small enough for conversation, large enough for danger. Florence waited until no one could mistake her words for privacy. "Agnes," she said lightly, "Lady Fenton was asking whether His Grace intends to continue calling." Lady Fenton's expression suggested she had asked no such thing. Agnes looked at Florence. "Then Lady Fenton might ask me herself." Lady Fenton became interested in the stage curtain. Florence smiled. "There is no need to be defensive." "I was not aware I was." Sir Archibald intervened with the weary patience of a father, pretending to moderate what he had no wish to stop. "Florence is concerned, Agnes. That is all." "About what?" Agnes asked. He glanced once toward the neighboring box where David had disappeared into the corridor with several other gentlemen. "About whether you understand the history attached to His Grace." Mrs. Bellamy's fan opened once with a soft snap. Agnes felt the room around them change. Not the whole theatre, only the people near enough to hear. That made it worse. Public cruelty in a small circle could travel faster than a speech from a stage. "I understand that London has one," Agnes said. Sir Archibald's expression tightened. "This is not merely gossip. His Grace was formally engaged 6 years ago. A wedding was expected. Days before it, he publicly ended the engagement." Florence added, "and the woman disappeared from society." Lady Fenton looked toward Agnes now. Agnes heard the trap. Every fact was framed to force her into either defending David without enough knowledge or condemning him in front of witnesses. "You seem remarkably certain of details none of you witnessed," she said. Sir Archibald's voice cooled. "The facts were public. Public facts are not always complete facts." Florence laughed softly. "You sound like him." "Perhaps because the distinction is useful." Florence's eyes sharpened. "Do you truly believe a woman of 34 is less disposable than a younger bride, simply because a duke has danced with her twice?" The question struck with more force than Agnes expected, not because she believed it, because Florence knew precisely where to aim. A silence formed around the small cluster. Mrs. Bellamy shifted her chair slightly closer to Agnes, not touching her, simply making allegiance visible. Before Agnes could answer, David's voice came from the corridor entrance. "That is enough." He had heard the final question, perhaps more. His face was composed, but Agnes knew him well enough now to recognize the restraint inside it. Sir Archibald rose halfway. "Your Grace." David bowed once. "Sir Archibald." Florence turned toward him. "Then perhaps you can settle it." Agnes saw what she wanted. Not truth, victory. David looked at Agnes before answering anyone else. What exactly would you like settled? Florence's confidence faltered at the question. Sir Archibald supplied the accusation. Whether the public account of your former engagement is false. David was silent for one beat. Then he said, no. The word moved through the group like a dropped glass. Florence's eyes widened. Sir Archibald looked almost satisfied. David continued. I was formally engaged. A wedding was expected. I publicly accepted responsibility for ending that engagement. Lady Fenton inhaled softly. Florence said, and the woman vanished. David's face changed by almost nothing. She left London society. Because of you? Florence asked. Agnes felt the danger sharpen. David could answer. She knew a certified marriage register extract existed. She knew he had shown her that much. She also knew he had refused to buy his reputation with another woman's private life. David said, I will not discuss her circumstances. Florence gave a faint, incredulous laugh. Even now, especially now. Sir Archibald's mouth hardened. You cannot expect Agnes to attach herself to a man who refuses to explain whether he destroyed another woman's prospects. David did not look at him. He looked at Agnes. Miss Lethbridge deserves many things. Another woman's private history is not mine to give her. The words landed differently now than they had in a quiet drawing room. Here, with people watching, his refusal looked exactly like guilt to anyone who preferred the simplest story. Agnes felt the social pressure gathering. She also felt the old instinct to smooth the room, rescue her father from embarrassment, protect Florence from consequences, save David from silence. She rejected all of it. This is not a theatre performance, she said. Every eye shifted to her. No one here is entitled to a confession merely because the curtain is down. Mrs. Bellamy's fan stilled. Lady Fenton looked away first. Sir Archibald said, Agnes, Papa. Her tone matched his. If you wish to judge His Grace, you may do so without pretending the judgment is for my protection. The bell sounded, warning the audience to return to their seats. Conversation broke unevenly. Guests withdrew. No one apologized. Florence looked furious because Agnes had refused the humiliation she had prepared. David remained where he was until the others moved away. His eyes met Agnes's. There was gratitude there, but something else too. Concern. Agnes did not smile, neither did he. The second act felt longer than the first. Agnes heard the music, watched the stage, and absorbed almost none of it. By the next interval, she knew exactly what she needed to ask. Mrs. Bellamy accompanied her into the adjoining passage and stopped several yards away beside an open doorway, near enough to satisfy propriety. David joined Agnes only after she nodded that he might. He did not reach for her. Agnes was grateful. Touch would have made the conversation harder, not easier. Is there anything in the truth? She asked. That would make my choice of you impossible. David answered without hesitation. No. Her heartbeat slowed slightly. Can you tell me enough to let that choice be informed? This time, he paused. Not because he did not know the answer. Because he disliked it. Not without permission I do not yet have. Agnes looked at him. From her, yes. And you will not break that confidence. No. She closed her eyes for one brief second, then opened them. I do not want you to. Relief touched his face and vanished because he understood there was more. But I will not build affection around a closed door and call that trust. The words hurt as she said them. David went very still. Agnes forced herself to continue. I respect why you are silent. I may even admire it. But respect is not enough for me to move further while I cannot make a fully informed choice. What are you asking? His voice was quiet, that we pause. The corridor seemed suddenly colder. David did not argue. He did not remind her of what had passed between them. He did not use the hand she had held as evidence against her. "Until I can give you more?" he asked. "Until you can give me enough?" His jaw tightened once. "That is fair." Agnes had expected resistance. His acceptance hurt more. "I am not punishing you. I know, and I am not asking you to betray her. I know that too." The bell sounded again. David stepped back, leaving her the space she had asked for. "Then I will not press you." "Thank you." He bowed. Nothing in the gesture suggested resentment. That made her want to call him back. She did not. By the time Agnes returned to Lady Hartingford's box, the rumour had already changed shape. She heard a woman behind her whisper that the Duke might be seeking a respectable older wife to repair a damaged name. A redemption match. Florence said nothing, which told Agnes enough. In the carriage home, Sir Archibald waited until the door closed before speaking. "Tomorrow you will make it known that Norchester's attentions were misunderstood." Agnes looked at him across the dim carriage. "No, Papa." His face hardened. Agnes did not look away. The next morning, Sir Archibald waited until breakfast had been served before attempting to turn obedience into a practical arrangement. Agnes recognized the method at once. Anger would have admitted that the previous night had mattered. Practicality allowed him to behave as though he were merely correcting an inconvenience. "I have written to the Harlands in Kent," he said, folding his newspaper beside his plate. "They would be delighted to receive you for a few weeks." Florence looked up from her tea. Agnes buttered a piece of toast she had no intention of eating. How fortunate for them. Sir Archibald ignored the tone. "London is unpleasant at present. A little distance would allow the nonsense surrounding Norchester to settle." "You mean the nonsense surrounding me?" "I mean both." "Then why am I the one being sent away?" Florence lowered her eyes. Sir Archibald's expression tightened. "Because you are 34 years old and ought to understand when a situation has become damaging." Agnes set down the knife. "Damaging to whom?" "To this family." "That answer is becoming very useful." "Do not be difficult. I am asking a simple question." Her father leaned back. "Florence's prospects are being affected. People are beginning to connect her with your involvement in a scandal that should never have touched this house." Florence's cup stopped halfway to her mouth. There it was. Not concern for Agnes, not even concern about David. The true objection was that Agnes had stopped absorbing discomfort privately and had allowed it to become visible enough to inconvenience someone else. His Grace's scandal was perfectly acceptable to you when you believed he might choose Florence, Agnes said. Sir Archibald's jaw hardened. "That is not relevant." "It seems remarkably relevant," Florence said. "Agnes, don't turn everything into an accusation." Agnes looked at her sister. "You asked me at the theatre whether I thought a woman of 34 was less disposable than a younger bride." Florence flushed. "I was upset, and I was humiliated." "You defended him." "I defended the right of another woman not to have her private life dragged through a theatre corridor for entertainment. That is not the same as defending every choice His Grace has ever made." Sir Archibald struck the table lightly with 2 fingers, the restrained gesture more threatening than noise. "Enough. You will leave London for a few weeks. By the time you return, people will have found something else to discuss." Agnes looked at him and felt with startling calm the end of a habit she had mistaken for peace. She had spent years yielding rooms, opportunities, explanations, and attention because refusing was always described as selfish. When she had refused Mr. Harcourt, The family had turned it into evidence of failure. Now that she refused to disappear, they would call that failure too. The pattern would continue as long as she helped maintain it. "No, Papa." Sir Archibald stared at her. "You said that last night." "I meant it last night. You live under my roof. I am aware of the address. Then you will remember what is expected." Agnes folded her napkin carefully. "I have spent years making myself smaller so other people might remain comfortable. I will not now vanish to make your story easier." Florence's face changed. "This is because of him." "No." Agnes turned toward her. "That is what you keep refusing to understand. You were perfectly content with me when I wanted nothing that disturbed your place. I was quiet. That is not always the same as content." Florence's lips parted, but no answer came. Agnes rose. "I will continue living at Lethbridge House. I will not create gossip by pretending I have been banished from London, and I will not create more by moving into another household without reason. But Mrs. Bellamy will act as my principal chaperone for calls and public engagements I choose to attend." Sir Archibald laughed once in disbelief. "You have decided this without consulting me?" "Yes." "And your aunt agreed?" Agnes permitted herself the faintest smile. "I wrote to her at 7 this morning. You assumed she would answer. She did." Florence looked almost offended by the efficiency of it. Sir Archibald's face darkened. "You are making a spectacle of yourself." "No, I am refusing to disappear from one." She left before the argument could become circular. By 3 that afternoon, Agnes sat in Mrs. Bellamy's drawing room, with her hands folded tightly enough in her lap to prevent herself from touching the mother-of-pearl shuttle. Inside her reticule, her aunt occupied a chair near the window, with correspondence spread before her. "You know, Mrs." Bellamy said without looking up. "When your father was 27, he once refused to attend Christmas dinner because your grandfather told him his waistcoat was vulgar." Agnes blinked. "Why are you telling me this?" Perspective. "Did he leave London?" "No. He sulked upstairs and made everyone else miserable." Agnes laughed despite herself. "I feel strangely restored. Good. His Grace is here." The butler announced David a moment later. He entered with the same composed restraint. Agnes had seen at the theatre, but the moment he looked at her, she understood he had not come to persuade her to resume anything that mattered. He bowed to Mrs. Bellamy and then to Agnes. "Mrs. Bellamy, Miss Lethbridge." "Your Grace," Agnes said. Mrs. Bellamy indicated a chair positioned within the open line of sight from her writing desk. "I am told civilized people can survive a conversation without my directing it." David sat opposite Agnes. "I am willing to attempt the experiment." Mrs. Bellamy returned to her letters. For several seconds, Agnes and David simply looked at one another. It was strange how difficult distance became once touch had acquired meaning. At the exhibition, he had covered her hand. At Mrs. Bellamy's house, they had held hands long enough for silence to become reassurance. Last night, Agnes had deliberately taken both away. She did not regret it. That did not make the absence painless. David spoke first. "I owe you an apology." Agnes had expected explanation. The directness unsettled her. For what? Not for keeping a confidence that is not mine to break. Good. For believing that honorable intention was sufficient. Agnes held still. David continued. "I knew my silence had consequences for me. I did not fully understand that if I asked you to know me while maintaining that silence, I was asking you to carry part of the cost." His voice remained, low and controlled, but nothing in the words was defensive. "I allowed uncertainty to become a condition you were expected to bear if you wished to remain close to me. That was unfair. Agnes felt the pressure behind her ribs loosen slightly. You could have said I knew from the beginning that you were withholding something. You did. You could have said I chose to continue. You did that too. David looked directly at her. Neither fact absolves me from noticing when the arrangement stopped being fair. Agnes had spent much of the morning being told her discomfort was the price of family convenience. Hearing someone acknowledge the cost without asking her to minimize, it affected her more than she wanted. She looked down at her hands. Thank you. David nodded once. There is something else. Go on. I am going to write to the woman whose privacy I have been protecting. Agnes looked up. He had still not given her a name. He did not need to ask permission, only to disclose what you need in order to make an informed decision. And if she refuses, David's expression tightened, but the answer came cleanly. I will respect it. Agnes's heart sank, despite knowing it was the only answer she could accept. And then I will not ask you to resume the courtship. The room seemed suddenly very quiet. Mrs. Bellamy's pen scratched across paper near the window. Somewhere below, a door closed. Agnes wanted to reach across the space between them. She wanted the reassurance of his hand, the steadiness she remembered. She did not move. Comfort could not be permitted to replace the accountability he had just offered. David noticed the impulse anyway. His gaze dropped briefly to her hands, then returned to her face. He did not reach either. My father wants me to leave London, Agnes said. His expression changed. Because of last night. Because Florence prospects may be inconvenienced by my continued existence in public. David's mouth hardened. What will you do? Agnes had expected outrage. She had not expected the question. Stay. He waited. I will remain at Lethbridge House. My aunt will act as principal chaperone for calls and engagements I choose. I will not disappear, so my father can tell society I was embarrassed into retreat. A quiet approval entered David's eyes. What do you want from me? Agnes breathed out. Nothing public, no confrontation, no pressure on my father, no use of your rank to make the gossip quieter. It would be effective. Yes, and wrong. Yes, David nodded. Then I will follow your lead. Even if he insults you again, if it concerns me, I may answer for myself. A trace of dry humor returned. If it concerns you, I suspect you are considerably better equipped. Agnes almost smiled. You are learning. Slowly. My mother would approve. The words brought both of them, for one brief instant, back to the shuttle and the quiet afternoon when she had placed her hand in his. Neither reached for the memory physically. That restraint made it more present. David rose when the proper length of the call had passed. I will send the letter today. Agnes stood as well. I will not ask whether she will answer. I do not know. I will not ask what you think she will say. I do not know that either. He looked at her with an openness she had not seen in him at the beginning. I only know that you were right to ask for enough truth to choose freely. Agnes swallowed. And you were right not to give away what was not yours. The sadness in his expression was almost a smile. We are inconveniently reasonable. It is exhausting, Mrs. Bellamy made a suspicious sound over her correspondence. David bowed. He did not offer his hand. Agnes was grateful for that too. At the door he paused. Whatever answer comes, I will not make it your burden to repair. Good. Good afternoon, Miss Lethbridge. Good afternoon, Your Grace. After he left, Agnes remained standing for several moments. She had not resumed the courtship. David had not asked her to. A letter would leave Norchester House before evening, carrying a question toward a woman. Agnes had never met, and whose silence had shaped 6 years of another man's life. For the first time since David had shown her the folded certificate. The next truth did not depend on what he was willing to reveal. It depended on whether the woman at the center of the old scandal believed any part of her history could safely be spoken at all. 3 days after David sent his letter, Agnes received a note asking whether Mrs. Bellamy would permit him to call at 2 o'clock. The wording was formal. "Nothing in it," said the woman had answered. Nothing said whether the answer had been yes. By 1:30, Agnes had read the same page of a novel 4 times and could not have named a single character in it. Mrs. Bellamy noticed without comment. Her aunt sat at the escritoire beside the window, with correspondence arranged in small, disciplined stacks, giving Agnes the dignity of pretending she was not waiting. The mother-of-pearl tatting shuttle remained inside Agnes's reticule beside her chair. She had almost taken it out twice. Each time she stopped herself. Today was not a day for occupying nervous hands. At precisely 2, David was announced. Agnes knew the answer before he spoke because he carried 2 folded papers. He bowed to Mrs. Bellamy, then to Agnes. "Mrs. Bellamy, Miss Lethbridge." "Your Grace," Agnes said. Mrs. Bellamy gestured toward the chair opposite Agnes. "You may sit. I have decided that propriety is most efficiently served when everyone behaves as though I am deaf." David's mouth moved faintly. A formidable system. It has preserved several reputations. She returned to her correspondence. David sat. For one moment, neither he nor Agnes looked at the papers in his hand. She answered. Agnes said, "Yes, and?" David placed the first folded letter on his knee, but did not offer it immediately. She gave permission. Agnes released a breath she had not realized she was holding. Relief came first. Then caution followed. For what exactly? To tell you the facts necessary for you to make the choice you ask to make. His expression remained serious, and, if circumstances make it unavoidable, to state the same narrow facts publicly. Nothing more. Nothing more. Agnes nodded. Then I want only what she has permitted. David handed her the letter. Her name is Mrs. Warden. It was the first time he had given the woman an identity. Agnes looked down at the handwriting. The letter was brief, direct, and unsentimental. Mrs. Warden wrote that she had no wish to return to London's curiosity or have old private matters reopened. She authorized David to disclose the date of her marriage and the fact that it had occurred before his public announcement concerning their former engagement. If public clarification ever became necessary, he could state only that chronology. She asked him not to turn the history of her departure into a story for society's consumption. Let the dates be enough. Agnes read the letter twice. Nothing in it begged forgiveness or expressed gratitude. She admired that Mrs. Warden had not written as a woman asking permission to keep her own past. She had written as one setting the terms under which it could be mentioned. Agnes returned the letter directly to David. Is she well? David's eyes changed. Yes, good. Agnes looked at the second paper. And that, David held it for a moment before giving it to her, the certified extract I showed you at Lethbridge House. Agnes recognized the plain wrapper, though she had never seen the contents. This time he placed it in her hands. She unfolded it carefully. Her eyes went first to the names, Mrs. Warden, Mr. Warden, then to the date, 14th of April, 1852. Agnes read it again. She married him on the 14th. Yes, and your announcement? The 16th. Agnes looked up. 2 days later. Yes, the old scandal rearranged itself inside her mind with almost brutal simplicity. London believed David had ended an engagement, and the intended bride had disappeared afterward. The document showed that by the time David publicly accepted blame, the woman society, believed abandoned, had already married another man. "Then you did not leave her before the wedding," Agnes said. "No, she had already married someone else." "Yes." Agnes looked back at the certificate. The proof did not make David innocent of every human error. It did something more precise. It destroyed the sequence on which London's favorite accusation depended. She folded the document along its existing crease and held it carefully. "Why wait 2 days?" David's gaze lowered briefly. "Because her family knew she was gone. They did not yet know where. They suspected someone had helped her leave, and they were looking for a way to recover control of the situation." Agnes understood the word control. If you had announced immediately that she had married another man, they would have known what to search for and whom to pressure. She and her husband needed time to get beyond their immediate reach. So you allowed London to believe she disappeared because you rejected her. Yes, there was no pride in the answer. I thought it would be temporary. Agnes watched him. But temporary became 6 years. Yes, why keep the certificate? David looked at the paper in her hands. At first, because if her family challenged the marriage or accused her husband of wrongdoing, chronology might matter. Later, because destroying it seemed careless, and using it for my own reputation seemed worse. Agnes returned the extract to him, because it would turn her fear into your defense. His eyes met hers. Exactly. David folded the certificate and placed it with Mrs. Warden's letter, returning both to his own possession. Agnes sat quietly for several seconds. The truth was not romantic. That relieved her. There had been no secret melodrama, no heroic gesture designed for admiration. A woman had wanted another life. Her family had power. David had chosen a silence that protected her when protection mattered. Then he had continued carrying the same silence long after its original purpose had changed. "You were right not to expose her," Agnes said. "At first." David heard the qualification. "And later, I think you confused continuing to suffer with continuing to protect." His face tightened slightly. Agnes continued. "I am not saying you should have told London everything. You should not have. But there were ways to say enough without telling all, if she had permitted it. I never asked." "Why?" David was silent for a long moment. "Because I had already decided what honor required." Agnes thought of part 6, of his hand open between them and his confession that silent blame had become a measure of virtue, and once you had decided, you stopped asking whether the decision was still serving anyone. Yes, the admission was quiet, including me, including you. Agnes felt the old ache of the theatre corridor return, but it no longer felt like a closed door. David had opened what he could, without violating the person behind it. More importantly, he had admitted the flaw in waiting so long to seek permission. "I am sorry," he said. No argument followed, no explanation disguised as apology. "I am sorry that I asked you to step closer while leaving you to wonder whether there was something in the darkness that should stop you." Agnes looked at him. She had expected truth to make her feel safe. Instead, it made her feel something more difficult. Tenderness. David had protected another woman imperfectly but genuinely. He had also allowed that protection to harden into isolation. For the first time, Agnes understood not only what he had done, but what it had cost him to become the sort of man who believed he should bear every cost alone. "David," she said. His entire expression changed at the sound of his name. Agnes felt the intimacy of it only after it had left her mouth. She did not take it back. She stood. David rose immediately. Mrs. Bellamy's pen continued moving at the escritoire, though Agnes suspected her aunt had not written a meaningful word in several minutes. Agnes stopped before David. "May I hold you?" Surprise crossed his face. Then something more vulnerable replaced it. "Yes." Agnes stepped forward and put her arms around him. Only then did David return the embrace. His arms settled carefully around her, as though even now he was determined not to assume more than she had offered. Agnes rested her cheek briefly against his coat. There was no triumph in the moment, no dramatic release, only the steady warmth of a man who had spent too long believing care meant standing alone beneath consequences. David exhaled slowly. Agnes tightened her arms once. He answered with the smallest answering pressure. Nothing possessive, nothing hurried. When she drew back, he let her go at once. They remained close enough that Agnes could see the emotion he had not hidden quickly enough. "Thank you," he said. "Do not thank me for choosing something I wanted." A faint smile reached him. "I am learning, slowly, painfully." Agnes returned to her chair, and David sat opposite her again. The distance no longer felt like punishment. "I am willing to resume the courtship," she said. David became very still. "Are you certain?" "Yes, but not under the old terms. Name the new ones." Agnes appreciated that he did not bargain before hearing them. Truth where it is yours to give, privacy where it belongs to someone else, and no fighting my family for me unless I ask. His brow lifted slightly. "That last condition may test my character. Then consider it useful instruction. If your father insults me, you may answer for yourself, and if he insults you, you let me answer first." David studied her, then nodded. Agreed. Even if silence costs you again, his expression changed. This time, the choice will not be mine alone. Agnes felt those words settle somewhere deeper than reassurance. The certificate had explained 6 years. The apology had repaired something more immediate, but it was that final promise that allowed her to believe their future might be built differently from both their pasts. David left Mrs. Bellamy's house with Mrs. Warden's letter and the certified extract still in his possession. Agnes watched him from the drawing-room window only until his carriage moved away. Then she sat, opened her reticule, and touched the smooth mother-of-pearl shuttle once before closing it again. She had not demanded another woman's secrets in order to choose a man. She had demanded only enough truth to ensure the choice was truly hers. And now that she had made it, Agnes knew the next test would not be private. London still believed the old story. Sir Archibald still intended to use it. The difference was that Agnes no longer stood beside a closed door, wondering what lay behind it. 2 days after Agnes resumed the courtship, David called at Mrs. Bellamy's house shortly after 3 in the afternoon, and, for the first time since the theatre, neither of them had a question waiting between them that belonged to someone else. Mrs. Bellamy received him in the drawing-room with tea, a raised eyebrow, and the announcement that the small walled garden behind the house was visible from 3 windows, and therefore suitable for people determined to remain respectable. "I have never known brickwork to inspire such confidence," David said. "You have not met enough aunts," Mrs. Bellamy replied. Agnes looked down to hide her smile. Her mother's mother-of-pearl tatting shuttle remained inside the reticule beside her chair. She had not brought it into the garden when, 10 minutes later, Mrs. Bellamy declared the afternoon too fine to waste indoors and allowed Agnes and David to walk outside while she remained near the open French doors with her correspondence. The garden was modest by Mayfair standards. A brick wall held climbing greenery. A pear tree cast broken shade across the path. Several late roses leaned over a low border, and nothing in the arrangement suggested privacy beyond what propriety permitted. David walked beside Agnes without immediately offering his arm. She noticed the restraint. "You may offer it when the path becomes difficult," she said. He looked at her. "I was attempting not to presume. There is a difference between presumption and asking. I have heard something similar before. Then perhaps repetition is finally working." His mouth curved. The path narrowed beside the pear tree. David offered his arm. Agnes accepted. The contact was ordinary, and that was precisely why she enjoyed it. Not every touch between them needed to carry the weight of permission, scandal, or confession. Sometimes a path narrowed, a gentleman offered his arm, and a woman chose to take it. They walked several steps before Agnes said, "We need to decide something before my father decides it for us." David's expression sharpened. "The next time he raises the scandal." "Yes." He stopped beneath the shade. Agnes released his arm and faced him. "If Papa insults your character privately, you may answer him. Generous. Do not become ambitious. I will try. If he attacks mine, I answer first." David nodded. "Agreed." "If he raises the old engagement publicly, you do not produce the certificate simply because you are angry." Something in his face became still. "Agreed. Even if what he says is cruel." "Agreed." Agnes studied him, ensuring he understood the full cost of the promise. "Mrs. Warden gave permission for limited disclosure if it becomes unavoidable. That does not make her history a weapon we are entitled to use whenever my family becomes unpleasant. No, if I decide the truth must be stated, I will tell you." David held her gaze. "How?" Agnes considered. "I will look at you before I answer him. If I want you to speak, I will hold your gaze and say nothing. And if you do not, then you let me decide which insults require an answer." David was silent long enough that Agnes knew he was not agreeing merely to please her. At last he said, "All right, that sounded reluctant." "It is? Why?" "Because I am discovering that restraint is considerably easier when no one I care about is being hurt." The words settled between them. Agnes felt the warmth of them, but she did not allow herself to be distracted from the point. "Then consider this practice. You have an alarming talent for improving my character. You arrived with material." A quiet laugh escaped him. They resumed walking, slower now. David kept his hands behind his back as though proving he could obey every boundary Agnes had named. She watched him for several moments. "You are overcorrecting." "Am I?" "You look as though touching anything in the garden might require written permission." His brows lifted. "Mrs. Bellamy did mention the roses." Agnes laughed. "I meant me." The humor faded from his expression, replaced by attention. "I know." They stopped near the far wall, where the drawing-room windows remained clearly visible. For a moment, neither spoke. The distance between them was proper. Agnes was nevertheless more aware of it than she had ever been of impropriety. David looked toward the house, then back at her. "May I ask another question?" "Yes." "When you said you were willing to resume the courtship, did you mean we should continue exactly as we did before the theatre?" Agnes thought about the hand-holding, the uncertainty, the careful closeness that had grown around a mystery neither could resolve yet. "No." Something flickered across his face before she added, "I want better than before." David became still. "Better how?" "Before, I liked you while part of me was waiting to discover whether liking you was foolish." Agnes looked directly at him. Now I know the truth that matters to my choice. I do not want to behave as if the only reason I am still here is because your reputation has been explained." His voice lowered. "Then why are you here?" The question did not sound uncertain. It sounded careful. Agnes had spent too many years being defined by what she had refused. Mr. Harcourt, her father's expectations, Florence's hierarchy, society's pity. David deserved an answer built from desire rather than defense. "Because I want you," she said. Nothing moved in his face for one heartbeat. Then emotion broke through the restraint with such clarity that Agnes felt her own breath catch. "Not because the certificate cleared you," she continued. "Not because Mrs. Warden gave permission. Not because you are a duke. I want the man who asked before touching my hand. The man who listened when I said no to uncertainty. The man who apologized without asking me to comfort him afterward." David looked away briefly, as though the wall had become safer than her face. When he looked back, the reserve was gone. "You make it very difficult to remain sensible. I had not realized that was my duty. It is becoming less convincing by the minute." Agnes smiled. David's gaze fell to her mouth and returned immediately to her eyes. The change in the air was unmistakable. He did not move closer. "May I kiss you?" he asked. Agnes's pulse rose, but nothing in her recoiled. She had imagined this moment once or twice, despite herself. None of those imaginings had mattered as much as the question. "Yes," she said. David still waited. Agnes understood. He had given her one more chance to decide not only whether the kiss happened, but how. She stepped toward him. David met her halfway. The kiss was gentle and deliberate, a brief meeting that became warmer only when Agnes remained close. His hand rested lightly against her upper arm. Agnes placed one gloved hand against the front of his coat, feeling the steady rise of his breath beneath the cloth. There was no urgency. No attempt to take more than she had given. When they parted, neither moved far. Agnes looked at him and discovered, to her surprise, that David Hedworth looked slightly stunned. "That was considerably less mysterious than your reputation," she said. He blinked. Then a laugh escaped him. "I am devastated. You will recover, will I? A duchy survives what ordinary men cannot." He stared at her for 1 second, then laughed fully. Agnes joined him, and the sound carried softly across the little garden. Near the French doors, Mrs. Bellamy looked up from her correspondence and immediately looked back down with exaggerated concentration. David shook his head. "Unfortunately, I remember almost everything you say. That seems inconvenient, increasingly." They returned to the drawing room at the proper pace and with entirely proper expressions, although Mrs. Bellamy's eyes suggested she was not deceived. "Did the roses prove interesting?" she asked. Agnes sat. "Extremely." David turned his face aside, which only made Mrs. Bellamy more suspicious. Before she could continue, the butler entered with 2 newly delivered notes. One was addressed to Mrs. Bellamy. The other bore Agnes's name in Lady Hartingford's hand. Agnes opened it. The message was brief. A large Mayfair garden reception would take place 4 days hence. Sir Archibald's name appeared among the family connections expected to attend. Beneath that, Lady Hartingford had added a more troubling line. Florence had begun offering acquaintances a new explanation for the Duke of Norchester's interest in Agnes. She had not yet repeated the full story in the note, only that it concerned Agnes's age, David's reputation, and the usefulness of gratitude. Agnes read the sentence twice. David saw her expression change. "What is it?" She folded the note. "Florence has found a new explanation for why you want me." His face cooled. "Do you know what she is saying?" "Not yet." Agnes looked toward the garden where, minutes earlier, they had agreed that neither of them would let other people decide the meaning of their choices, but I suspect we will. The morning before the Mayfair Garden reception, Agnes learned exactly what Florence had decided to call the Duke of Norchester's interest in her. The story arrived at Mrs. Bellamy's house shortly after 11, delivered by a woman Agnes knew only well enough to understand that concern was the most respectable disguise curiosity possessed. Mrs. Bellamy had received Mrs. Ellison in the front drawing room because refusing the call would have created more interest than accepting it. Agnes sat near the window with a closed book on her lap. She had not opened her reticule. The mother-of-pearl tatting shuttle remained inside, untouched. Mrs. Ellison spoke first of the weather, then of tomorrow's garden reception, then of Lady Hartingford's guest list. Only after all possible courtesies had been exhausted did she lower her voice. "I hesitated to mention this, Miss Lethbridge, but I thought you ought to know what is being said." Mrs. Bellamy's expression became almost pleasant. Agnes had learned that this was when her aunt was most dangerous. "Then I am fortunate you overcame your hesitation," Agnes said. Mrs. Ellison coloured faintly. "It concerns His Grace." "Naturally." Agnes waited. The woman leaned forward. "Miss Florence has suggested that the Duke's attentions are not quite what they appear," Mrs. Bellamy said. "How imaginative of her." Mrs. Ellison ignored the interruption. "The view is that His Grace's old scandal has made a certain kind of marriage useful to him. A respectable wife, mature, beyond the usual expectations of a first season." Agnes felt the insult before the sentence reached its end. Mrs. Ellison hurried onward, perhaps mistaking silence for permission. Someone who would be grateful enough not to inquire too closely into the past. Mrs. Bellamy set down her teacup with exquisite care. "And who, precisely, is supposed to be grateful?" Mrs. Ellison looked at Agnes. She did not need to answer. Agnes did it for her. "I am." "That is not how I would have phrased it." "No, you would have waited until someone else did." Mrs. Ellison flushed more deeply. Agnes felt no satisfaction. The rumor was too carefully built to be dismissed as ordinary jealousy. It insulted David by turning affection into strategy. It insulted Agnes by making her age evidence of desperation. Worse, it used every old assumption her family had made about her and dressed it in the language of practical explanation. She was 34. Therefore, she must be grateful. She had once refused marriage. Therefore, any later yes must be surrender. David had lived with scandal. Therefore, any courtship must be rehabilitation. "Is Florence saying His Grace wants me to repair his reputation?" Agnes asked. Mrs. Ellison hesitated. "Something of that sort, and that I would accept because I am unlikely to receive another offer." The woman looked miserable now. "Miss Lethbridge, I did not say that." "No, Florence did." Mrs. Bellamy rose, which ended the call more effectively than outrage could have. "Mrs. Ellison, thank you for your devotion to accuracy. I am sure Agnes will treasure it." 5 minutes later, the front door closed. Mrs. Bellamy returned to the drawing room and said, "I have 7 insulting responses available, none suitable for repetition in mixed company." Agnes stood and crossed to the window. "Save them. For Florence, for me, if I become tempted to answer this badly." Her aunt studied her. What would answering badly look like? "Letting David deny it before I decide what should be denied." Mrs. Bellamy nodded slowly. Agnes looked toward the street below. Tomorrow Sir Archibald would attend the garden reception. Florence would attend. So would many of the people who had heard the theatre version of David's past. The easiest solution would be to stay away. Agnes recognized the thought and rejected it before it could disguise itself as prudence. "I am going tomorrow," she said. "I assumed you were. I will not hide because Florence has found a more efficient insult." "Good." Mrs. Bellamy's mouth curved. "I had already chosen my bonnet." David arrived that afternoon at the proper hour. When he entered the drawing room, Agnes knew from his face that he had heard the rumor elsewhere. There was no need to repeat every word, but Agnes did so anyway. She wanted no misunderstanding between them when Florence's entire weapon depended upon one. Mrs. Bellamy settled at the escritoire with correspondence, while David sat opposite Agnes. He listened without interruption as she explained what Mrs. Ellison had brought. Only when Agnes finished did he speak. "She believes I chose you because you would be grateful. That is the version, and because marrying you would repair my reputation." Yes, his expression remained controlled, but anger appeared in the stillness of his shoulders. "I can answer that." Agnes met his gaze. "Not yet." David stopped. The change was immediate. All right. Agnes felt the familiar relief of being heard without having to defend the boundary twice. "Tomorrow, if Florence repeats it, I answer first." "Agreed. If Papa raises the old engagement and merely insults you, you answer for yourself if you choose." "Agreed. If he makes the scandal the reason I should deny you publicly, we follow the rule from the garden." David's eyes held hers. "I wait for your signal. Yes, and if you never give it, then Mrs. Warden's chronology remains private." David nodded once. The certified extract and Mrs. Warden's authorization were still his to safeguard. Agnes did not need to know where he had placed them. She only needed to know that tomorrow he would not use them without her consent. "There is one more thing," she said. "I am not going to deny you to protect myself from Florence's story." Something shifted in his face. "You do not owe me a public declaration." "I know." "Then why say it?" "Because I want you to understand the decision before tomorrow becomes unpleasant. I am attending because staying away would allow my father to call absence shame and Florence to call it regret. Neither is true." David leaned forward slightly. "And what is true?" Agnes thought of the kiss in Mrs. Bellamy's garden. She thought of his hand resting lightly against her arm and the way he had waited for her to close the distance. She thought of the theatre corridor where she had paused their courtship, and the afternoon when he had apologized without asking her to comfort him. "That I know what I am choosing," she said. David looked away for a moment. When he turned back, the anger had altered into something more vulnerable. "That rumor unsettles me more than the old scandal." Agnes had not expected the admission. "Why?" "Because the old story misjudges something I did." His voice lowered. "This one misjudges what I feel." Agnes became very still. David continued before restraint could return. "I have been admired for a title, feared for a silence, and condemned for a choice. You are the first person who asked who I was beneath all three." The room seemed to narrow around his voice. "You did not reward mystery because it was romantic. You stopped the courtship when trust required more. You did not ask me to betray another woman so you could feel secure. And when I was wrong about what my silence required of you, you made me answer for it." Agnes could hear Mrs. Bellamy's pen moving across paper, steady and deliberately distant. David looked directly at her. "I love you." The words were quiet, no ceremony, no protection hidden inside them, no proposal that forced Agnes to answer a question larger than the one he had actually asked. For one heartbeat, she felt all the old definitions of herself waiting beyond the room. Unmarried, difficult, useful, overlooked, grateful. None of them reached her. Agnes knew what she felt before David spoke. Hearing him say it simply removed the last reason to keep the knowledge unnamed. I love you too. David exhaled as though the sentence had struck somewhere beneath his composure. Agnes felt tears threaten and refused to apologize for them, which is precisely why tomorrow I will not let anyone call me your penance. A small, unsteady smile appeared on his face. You could never be that. I know. The answer mattered more because she did know. She did not need him to restore value Florence had damaged. David's love was not evidence that Agnes had finally become worthy. It was something freely given to a woman who had been worthy before he ever crossed a ballroom. Agnes extended her hand across the small space between their chairs. David looked at it, then at her. May I? Yes. He took her hand. The clasp was brief, warm, and steady. No kiss followed. They did not need one. Agnes tightened her fingers once. David returned the pressure. Tomorrow, he said, I will wait for you, even if my father provokes you. Especially then. Your education has advanced, at terrible personal cost. Agnes smiled. A duchy survives what ordinary men cannot. David laughed softly, and Mrs. Bellamy made a sound at the escritoire that was suspiciously close to amusement. When the proper length of the call had passed, David rose. At the door, he turned back once. Whatever happens tomorrow, I am not asking you to prove that you love me. Agnes met his gaze. Nor I you. Something tender moved across his expression. Then he left. Agnes remained standing after the door closed. Tomorrow, Florence would expect gratitude to make her weak. Sir Archibald would expect scandal to make her retreat. Society would expect David's rank to carry more authority than her voice. They were all mistaken in the same essential way. Agnes was not going to the garden reception, hoping to be chosen. She had already chosen. By 4 o'clock the next afternoon, the Mayfair garden reception had achieved the particular elegance that required dozens of servants, several hundred flowers, and the pretense that nothing had been arranged at all. Striped awnings shaded the terrace. Chairs stood beneath clipped trees. Groups of guests drifted between the lawn and the long drawing-room windows, with glasses of lemonade and conversation polished smooth by repetition. Agnes arrived beside Mrs. Bellamy and knew within minutes that Florence's story had reached farther than Mrs. Ellison's drawing-room visit suggested. No one stared. That would have been vulgar. Instead, several women greeted Agnes with unusual tenderness, as though she had suffered a private misfortune they were too considerate to name. One gentleman bowed to David across the lawn, then looked at Agnes with the cautious interest reserved for people standing too near a scandal. Agnes felt the old pressure rise, familiar now. Once, such attention would have made her search for the nearest quiet chair and become useful to someone else until no one remembered to look at her. Today she remained where she was. Mrs. Bellamy accepted a glass of lemonade from a passing footman. Your sister is watching the gate. Agnes followed her aunt's glance. Florence stood near Lady Hartingford beneath a pale awning, beautiful in white muslin embroidered with blue. Sir Archibald was several yards away, speaking with 2 acquaintances. He looked entirely composed. Agnes had learned to distrust that expression. She is waiting for him, Agnes said. Your father? No, David. Mrs. Bellamy's eyebrow rose at the given name, but she made no comment. David arrived a few minutes later. He crossed the terrace with the ease of a man accustomed to being noticed and indifferent to the fact. He greeted the hostess first, then several older guests whose rank required acknowledgement. Only after that did his gaze find Agnes. He did not come directly to her. They had agreed upon nothing so theatrical. He simply inclined his head. Agnes returned the gesture. Beneath his dark coat, David carried Mrs. Warden's written authorization and the same certified marriage register extract Agnes had read 6 days earlier. He had brought both because Agnes had asked him to be prepared. He would not use either unless she gave the signal. That knowledge steadied her more than the documents themselves. The power was not in the paper. It was in the agreement between them about when truth became necessary. Sir Archibald began moving toward Agnes before David had finished speaking to the hostess. Florence came with him. Lady Hartingford followed at a slower pace, accompanied by 2 ladies and an older gentleman. A small group formed naturally, no more than 10 or 12 people, close enough to hear without effort. Beyond them, the reception continued. Someone laughed near the terrace. A servant carried a tray through the open doors. The world did not stop because Sir Archibald intended to make a scene. He smiled at Mrs. Bellamy first. "I hope my sister-in-law is enjoying herself." "Immensely," Mrs. Bellamy said. "I am particularly fond of afternoons when no one tells me where I ought to stand." Sir Archibald's smile thinned. He turned to Agnes. "I am pleased you came. You knew I would. I hoped good sense might still prevail before matters became more difficult." Agnes looked at him. "Then I recommend avoiding difficulty." Florence's lips tightened. Sir Archibald lowered his voice just enough to preserve the appearance of family concern while ensuring everyone nearby could hear. "Agnes, I have no wish to embarrass you." Mrs. Bellamy took a slow sip of lemonade. Agnes said, "Then we agree on something." Sir Archibald ignored the warning. "But the attention you have encouraged from His Grace has placed you in an unfortunate position. I would prefer to settle it before gossip becomes permanent." "Settle what?" "Whether you intend to continue allowing his courtship." David had drawn closer now. He stopped at the edge of the group rather than beside Agnes. Sir Archibald noticed him and seemed almost relieved. "Your Grace, perhaps your presence is useful." David's expression remained unreadable. "That depends upon the use." Florence stepped in before her father could answer. "Agnes deserves to understand what people think." Agnes turned toward her. "Then say it plainly." Florence hesitated. She had expected insinuation to do the work. Agnes waited. So did everyone else. "They think His Grace needs you," Florence said at last. "For what?" "For respectability." A faint movement passed through the nearby guests. Florence found courage in it. "His reputation has been damaged for 6 years. He needs a wife no one would suspect of scandal. Someone mature, steady, grateful for the opportunity." Agnes felt the cruelty strike exactly where Florence intended. She let it pass through without answering yet. "Grateful," she repeated. Florence lifted her chin. "You know what I mean." "I would rather hear what you mean," Sir Archibald intervened. "There is no need for this." Agnes looked at him. "You began it." Florence's composure cracked. "Fine. An unmarried woman of 34 is not in the same position as a girl of 20. His Grace knows that. You know that. Everyone knows it." No one in the small group moved. Florence continued, faster now. "He gains a respectable wife who will not question his past too closely. You gain a title you were never likely to have otherwise. It is convenient." David's jaw tightened. He did not speak. Agnes saw the effort that silence cost him and loved him for keeping the promise. "And you believe that is why he chose me," Agnes said. Florence's eyes flicked toward David. "What other explanation survives his history?" Sir Archibald exhaled as though forced into paternal duty. His Grace was formally engaged 6 years ago. A wedding was expected. Days before it, he publicly ended the engagement. The lady disappeared from society. Those facts remain. David said nothing. Sir Archibald turned to Agnes. I am asking you, as your father, to say clearly that you will not attach yourself to a man whose history makes such a marriage questionable. Agnes held his gaze. No. His face changed. No, I will not say that. Agnes, you asked, I answered. Florence gave a brittle laugh. Of course you did. You have spent years insisting you did not care whether anyone chose you, and now a duke appears. Suddenly, principle becomes very flexible. Agnes did not answer her. She looked at David. She held his gaze. She said nothing. The signal. David reached inside his coat. The movement drew every nearby eye, but he did not hurry. He removed Mrs. Warden's authorization first. There is one factual matter I am permitted to correct, he said. His voice carried only as far as the people already listening. Nothing beyond it will be discussed. Sir Archibald frowned. Permitted by whom? Mrs. Warden? Florence's face shifted. David did not explain the name. He unfolded the authorization enough to reference it, then produced the certified extract. The woman to whom I was once engaged legally married Mr. Warden on the 14th of April, 1852. A murmur moved through the cluster. David continued before anyone could interrupt. I publicly announced the end of our former engagement on the 16th. Lady Hartingford stared at him. After she was already married? Yes. Sir Archibald's confidence faltered. David held the extract, but did not offer it around. I accepted the appearance of blame, because correcting the sequence at the time would have exposed circumstances that were not mine to reveal. Mrs. Warden has authorized me to state the chronology. She has not authorized her private history to become entertainment, and I will not make it so. One of the older gentlemen said quietly, Then you did not abandon her before a wedding. David looked at him. The public version is wrong about the order of events. That was all. No heroic explanation. No invitation to admire him. He folded the extract, placed it with Mrs. Warden's letter, and returned both to his possession. Sir Archibald recovered with visible effort. Whatever the exact dates, the affair was still scandalous. Agnes cannot reasonably be expected to attach herself to such a history. Agnes turned toward him. The moment had arrived with less anger than she had imagined. Perhaps because she had been waiting for it since the wedding breakfast. If His Grace's history makes him unsuitable for me today, Papa, why was the same history acceptable when you believed he might choose Florence? Sir Archibald went still. Florence looked at him. Agnes continued only enough to close every escape. You knew the public version before His Grace ever asked me to dance. You told Florence a duchy could survive what ordinary men could not. Sir Archibald's face reddened. That was an entirely different situation. How? Agnes, this is neither the time nor the place. You made it both. He looked toward the surrounding guests and found no rescue. Agnes asked again quietly, How was it different? Florence spoke before her father could. Because it was. Agnes turned to her. How? Florence's breath came faster. Because we thought he would choose me. Silence followed. Not dramatic silence. Worse, the uncomfortable kind in which everyone present suddenly understood something they had not wanted stated plainly. Florence seemed to hear her own words only after they were spoken. Agnes looked at her sister. That is the wound, Florence. You were taught that being chosen made one woman valuable, and being overlooked made another ridiculous. She stopped there. Florence's face lost its defiance. Sir Archibald opened his mouth. then closed it. One of the ladies beside Lady Hartingford murmured something about greeting the hostess and moved away. The older gentleman followed. Another woman turned toward the terrace. No one applauded. No one condemned Sir Archibald aloud. They simply stopped standing with him. In their world, it was enough to be understood. David still waited. Only when Agnes looked at him again did he speak. I chose Miss Lethbridge before I knew whether she would ever choose me. Agnes felt no need to look around the circle, and now I do. Something warm entered David's eyes. He did not touch her. He did not ask for her hand. He bowed his head once, receiving the answer without converting it into spectacle. Sir Archibald looked suddenly older. Florence looked away. Agnes felt neither triumph nor pity strong enough to erase what had happened. Consequence was not cruelty. It was simply the end of pretending words had no cost. Mrs. Bellamy stepped beside Agnes. I believe there is lemonade somewhere not being used for moral instruction. Agnes almost laughed. That sounds restorative. The group dissolved. David did not follow immediately. He waited until Agnes and Mrs. Bellamy had crossed half the terrace, and until propriety made his approach look ordinary. Then he joined them near the edge of the lawn. Mrs. Bellamy moved several paces ahead to inspect a row of potted geraniums she had no visible interest in. David looked at Agnes. "Are you all right?" "Yes, are you certain?" "No," she admitted, "but I will be." His expression softened. "When may I call again?" Agnes thought of the first call at Lethbridge House, the certificate he would not show her, the hand he asked permission to touch, the silence she had refused to live inside forever, and the love they had named before anyone else approved of it. "Tomorrow," she said. David smiled. Tomorrow, 5 weeks after the garden reception, Agnes discovered that courtship became far more, revealing once scandal stopped doing most of the talking. David called when he said he would. He accompanied her and Mrs. Bellamy on drives and formal visits. He listened before offering solutions, which Agnes privately considered evidence of remarkable progress in a duke. She learned that he disliked over-sweetened preserves, preferred morning correspondence to late-night paperwork, and possessed a quiet impatience with men who confused volume with intelligence. David learned that Agnes could not pass a crooked picture frame without straightening it, that she sometimes forgot tea when absorbed in reading, and that being useful remained one of her deepest habits, even when no one had asked anything of her. Sir Archibald did not apologize for the garden reception. He simply ceased attempting to control Agnes's social engagements, which was less satisfying than repentance and considerably more practical. Florence became quieter. Several acquaintances who had once welcomed her invitations eagerly now answered with greater delay. Society had not suddenly developed a conscience. It merely disliked being made to feel foolish. And Florence's confession had revealed how willingly some people had repeated a family grievance as fact. Agnes did nothing to repair the damage, neither did she rejoice in it. Consequences required no assistance from her. On a warm afternoon near the end of July, David arrived at Mrs. Bellamy's house for a formal call, looking so composed that Agnes immediately distrusted him. Her aunt noticed too. After tea had been poured, Mrs. Bellamy gathered a thick letter from the escritoire and settled near the window. "My cousin in Bath has written 6 pages about her neighbor's conservatory," she announced. "I intend to give the matter the attention it deserves." Agnes looked at her. "That sounds severe. I have survived worse." David's mouth twitched. Mrs. Bellamy unfolded the first page and became ostentatiously absorbed. David sat opposite Agnes. For once, there was no certificate between them, no rumor waiting outside the door, no family ultimatum requiring an answer, only him. Agnes found that strangely more frightening. "I have been considering proposals," David said. Agnes stared at him. "In general, no, that is reassuring. I have concluded that many marriage proposals are poorly constructed. You have been studying them. I have been avoiding making one badly." Agnes's heartbeat changed. David did not kneel. He did not produce a ring, as though proof of wealth might strengthen the question. He leaned forward slightly and looked at her with the same steady attention that had first unsettled her at the wedding breakfast. "I could ask whether you would become the Duchess of Norchester," he said, "but the title is not what I want you to choose." Agnes said nothing. "I could ask whether you would allow me to provide for you. But you have spent enough years having other people define care as the right to make your decisions." Her throat tightened. David continued, quieter now. "So I will ask only this. Will you marry me because you want the life we make together?" The question reached her more deeply than any declaration built around rank could have done. Mr. Harcourt had once asked Agnes to enter a life whose terms had already been decided. Her father had spent years treating marriage as a verdict upon whether she had succeeded as a woman. David was asking her for neither surrender nor validation. He was asking whether she wanted the ordinary days as much as she wanted him. Agnes smiled before the tears reached her eyes. "Yes." David became entirely still. "Yes. Would you like me to reconsider for dramatic effect?" "No." Relief broke across his face with such unguarded warmth that she laughed. "Then yes, David, I will marry you because I want the life we make together." He extended one hand and stopped halfway, the old habit of asking still stronger than impulse. "May I?" Agnes placed her hand in his before he finished. "You may." His fingers closed around hers. Across the room, Mrs. Bellamy appeared to spend an extraordinary amount of time reading the same sentence about a conservatory. The banns were called on 3 successive Sundays. David and Agnes made no attempt to shorten the process, merely because London already considered the conclusion obvious. 4 weeks after the proposal, they were married in the parish church, before relatives, friends, and enough society acquaintances to prevent anyone from calling the ceremony hidden. Sir Archibald did not attend. Pride kept him away where affection might have brought a wiser man despite embarrassment. Several relatives noticed his absence. None asked Agnes to explain it. For once, she did not feel responsible for making another person's choice comfortable. Florence did not come to Lethbridge House before the wedding. Instead, she sent a letter. Agnes read it alone the evening before the ceremony. The apology was not graceful. That made it more believable. Florence admitted that she had spent years believing Agnes's unmarried state proved a hierarchy between them. When David chose Agnes's company, Florence had experienced it not as Agnes gaining happiness, but as Florence losing the identity she had been taught to value. She wrote that understanding this did not excuse what she had said. She did not ask Agnes to forget. Agnes answered with equal brevity. She would accept the apology as a beginning. Nothing more was promised. On the wedding morning, Agnes used her mother's mother-of-pearl tatting shuttle to begin a narrow piece of lace, while Mrs. Bellamy complained that no bride should be allowed needlework before breakfast. Agnes had intended to finish the edge before leaving the house. Habit made such promises easily. After the ceremony, when the vows were complete and she became the Duchess of Norchester, the title felt less like transformation than circumstance. Agnes Lethbridge had not vanished inside it. The wedding breakfast afterward reminded her at once of the family wedding earlier that summer. There were flowers, silver, champagne. Relatives speaking too loudly, but no one joked about unmarried women. No one predicted which girl would be next. No one made another person's future into entertainment. Mrs. Bellamy cried openly during one toast and denied it before anyone accused her. An elderly cousin informed David that wedding cake had declined severely since the reign of William IV. David listened with grave concern. Agnes laughed until her cheeks hurt. Her open reticule rested beside her chair. Inside lay the mother-of-pearl shuttle and the narrow strip of lace she had begun that morning. 3 small loops remained unfinished. David noticed when guests began moving toward the front hall for the couple's departure. "You have not finished it," he said. Agnes looked down. "Apparently marriage has destroyed my standards." "Already? You have been a terrible influence. I had hoped to accomplish more before luncheon." She touched the shuttle with one finger. Once, unfinished work would have followed her from room to room like an accusation. Something useful should be completed before pleasure began. Someone else's needs should be settled before her own were considered. "Do you mean to finish it before we leave?" David asked. Agnes looked toward the open front doors where their carriage waited in the summer light. Then she folded the unfinished lace once, placed it beside the shuttle, and closed the reticule. "Tomorrow." Reckless. Reckless. I was warned marriage might change me. Who warned you? No one sensible. They reached the entrance while the remaining guests gathered farther behind them. For one brief moment, screened by the angle of the doorway and the waiting carriage, they had something close to privacy. David turned toward her. "Ready?" Agnes looked at the man who had first noticed when everyone else laughed, who had learned that silence could protect and still wound, who had asked before touching her and listened when she said, "Stop." Almost. She lifted one hand to his face and kissed him. David answered immediately, gently, one hand settling at her waist only after she leaned closer. Nothing about the kiss felt like proof. It was simply affection freely given after every necessary choice had already been made. When they parted, he rested his forehead briefly against hers. "I love you," he said. Agnes smiled. "I love you too." Then she stepped into the carriage beside him. London moved past the windows in warm afternoon light as they left the wedding breakfast behind. Inside Agnes's reticule, her mother's mother-of-pearl shuttle rested beside the deliberately unfinished lace. For once, something useful could wait.